Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jane Jacoby in the Office of Research Development at Clemson. We welcome you all here today for the second in our workshop series for the 22-23 academic year. If you don't know much about the Office of Research Development, we're located in the Strom-Thurmond Institute, affectionately called the Bunker. And our job is to support faculty in getting funding for their research. We have a number of different functions, but in our professional development arm, we offer informational workshops, one-on-one and group coaching. We provide access to consultants such as Lucy Deckard, who is our guest speaker today, team building, and professional development and editing services. So please feel free to visit our website, linked off the main Division of Research page, and I'll show you on the next slide our URL. We are a small team of 4 people comprising the Associate Vice President for Research, Sheila Cotton. I'm the team lead. We have Morgan Simpson as our research development specialist, and Brett Levi, many of you know because he manages the limited submissions and the R initiatives. So some of the resources that we have that you might want to take advantage of include our archive of workshop recordings. There is on our website not only links to videos, but also the slide sets that you'll be able to look at later. So this gets added to as we go through the years, and please take advantage of those. We also have, of course, proposal development and editing services that we offer. You can email us directly and ask for help with particular proposals. Typically, we focus on the ones that are 2 million and above, but there are extenuating circumstances that may allow us to look at proposals for smaller pots of money as well. So it doesn't hurt to ask, and we will certainly help you as we have time. We also offer very popular academies for early career faculty. These include our career workshop, the Career Academy that I lead in the spring semester. It's a multiple month effort. So those of you who are considering the career proposals would want to sign up for that. We also have our hand in the NIH Accelerator program as well. So if you are an NIH investigator, you should look into that. They'll be setting up another cohort about a year from now. Our initiative funding opportunities are very popular with faculty. It covers a wide range of things. Again, this is money that is managed by the Division of Research that the Vice President for Research makes available to faculty to help jumpstart their research in various ways. And we are building our repository of proposals that you can see examples of proposals to different agencies as well as their reviews. The next workshop coming up is Applications of Team Science. That's on October 17th. You can go to our website or to the main Division of Research website and look at the schedule of events. It's my pleasure today to introduce Lucy Deckard. She is the president of a consulting firm called Academic Research Funding Strategies. This group puts out a monthly newsletter for which we have an institutional subscription that is really, really helpful. If you're not getting that forwarded to you from your ADRs or other means, you can find those newsletters archived also on the Office of Research Development website. she has a long career, both as a scientist herself, an engineer, working on proposals, and then she served as the associate director of the Office of Proposal Development, so the counterpart to our Office of Research Development at Texas A&M. In that capacity, she helped to develop and write a bunch of different sorts of proposals. So she brings all of that experience, plus all the experiences she's had in the past, Lucy, about 12 years, I guess, of you're running this consulting firm.
Yeah.
We contract Lucy to help faculty with large proposals. She also provides people who are more domain experts, who look at the career proposals that come out of the Career Academy every year. And this is her second time around with us, delivering this workshop, just kind of a proposal writing 101. We're really happy to have her today, and without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so Lucy can do hers.
Okay, thank you, Jane. Thanks everybody for joining me. I know that time is precious these days, and so I really appreciate you taking the time to come and kind of sit through this. Before we get started, I wanted to just really quickly go through some housekeeping. So first of all, if you go to the chat, there's this link, which you also see on the slide on your screen. So of course, the problem is on the screen, their links are not very helpful. So you can download all the slides and from this Dropbox, as well as there's a whole lot of other information you may or may not need. So you can kind of pick and choose what makes sense for you. Hopefully that will be helpful, because they're, part of the challenge of figuring out, kind of where you want to apply for funding, figuring out how to write a proposal, understanding what the funder is looking for, is figuring out where to find the information. And so because of that, there are a number of links here that kind of provide entry points to various agencies. And so that's why the slides are helpful compared to just, watching them go by on your screen. Also, as you're probably aware, we are recording this. So if you do have to step out, or if you have a colleague at Clemson who you think would be interested in watching some or all of this, it will be available for 6 months. So the slides you get to keep forever. They do, some of the information does, of course, age out after a while because things change, but the recording is also going to be available for 6 months to anybody at Clemson. So you feel free to, you can share that link, which will be coming out probably in a few days. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, just a little background about me. I'm the president of Academic Research Funding Strategy. So we are a separate consulting business, and it's a team of us, kind of a loosely or associated team of folks who've worked on proposals. And what we bring, and what I'm bringing to this workshop, is basically this experience over many years, over 20 years of working on a lot of proposals, more than any one PI normally would work on, right? So every year I'm working on many, many proposals. I see them go in, I see them come back, I see what reviews are like, and I see kind of patterns. When you do that many proposals, you start to see patterns. And I see things that tend to work really well, and I see mistakes that are really easy to make. So that is kind of what's going to inform what I'm going to talk about. Obviously, I can't talk about everything, but I hope to at least help you get a fast start if you're new, or if, let's say, you're moving from one agency, maybe you're more, kind of in mid-career, but you're moving from one agency to another, or you're trying to get back to getting funding, you haven't had to have any in the past. Hopefully what I can tell you at least help you get past those mistakes that are easy to make, and kind of make sure your proposal is strong, even the first time you're writing a proposal, maybe ever, or maybe in a long time. All right, the most important thing here is my email address. It's, if you have any questions later, if I said something and you felt like, that didn't make sense, or I wish I'd asked a question, feel free to email me. I'm always happy to answer questions. That kind of brings up a caveat. I will say some general things, and for everything I say, there's probably an exception. So everything I say, you're going to want to filter through your own discipline, your own type of project, and your funder. So I am going to talk much more about process issues. So like, how do you understand what your funder's looking for? But always, working with your colleagues, talking to people who know the funder and know your discipline is important. So, there are always going to be differences and idiosyncrasies depending on the funder and the discipline. So you always want to keep that in mind. All right, so what we're going to cover in the next this afternoon is basically we're going to talk a little bit about what do you do before you start writing. Okay, so there's a lot you need to do in order to understand who your audience is, what they're looking for, determining whether you can be competitive for a particular grant opportunity, making sure the opportunity you're looking at actually fits what you want to do, all that stuff, talking to the program officer. So we'll talk about that. Well, then we'll go into grantsmanship basics. So what are the kind of general things that you need to know in terms of just the grantsmanship? And we will talk about how to grab your reviewer in the early pages of your proposal. Then we'll discuss your research plan and the various kind of typical sections of proposals and what you need to do in each section, kind of things, again, kind of going through that model of, well, what works well, what are the mistakes that are easy to make that you want to avoid. And then we'll go step through other components. There are a number of slides toward the end that probably are more informational, and I may skip over those, particularly if we're tight on time, because I do want to have time for us to talk and do exercises. So when we get to, kind of the more informational stuff, then you'll be able to download these slides, as I already mentioned. For those of you who joined after I put this up, go to the chat. And the link here will allow you to download the slides so you can get all the slides, even if I jump over some. And I should also mention, there are a number of slides that I have hidden that you will be able to access. So on National Institutes of Health. So many of you may not be at all interested in NIH. So I don't want to get into the weeds too much on that funder. Same thing with other funders. So be sure and look at the slides if you want more information about a particular agency. All right. And then I will talk about all the other kind of parts of the proposal that you need to kind of develop. And then we will talk about interpreting and responding to reviews. So this is a sad fact of life about getting funding, is that a big part of getting funding is being declined, having your proposals declined. Everybody goes through this experience, and a lot of the success that people end up experiencing, if they do experience success, is from their ability to read the reviews and analyze what the reviewers are trying to tell them and respond appropriately. Either, kind of revise and resubmit their proposal, go to a different funder, change their project. All those things are important. And so usually if you get funded the first time you put a proposal in for an idea, I would tell you to go buy a lottery ticket, right? That you really want to think of this as, I'm putting this in, I'm going to get some feedback. I want to do my best so I get helpful feedback rather than feedback that says I don't understand this proposal, right? So you want to write it up well, but you want to kind of go in knowing it's very likely I won't get funded the first time, but I'm going to learn from this and I'm going to write a better proposal next. Okay, so, and as I said, if anybody has any questions, just type it in the chat. I'm happy to stop and answer questions throughout this whole thing. I don't want this just to be me talking for the next several hours, so feel free to jump in with some questions. All right, so let's talk a little bit about all the things you need to do before you write. I think a lot of times a mistake people make is thinking, oh, I have an idea. I have an idea for a funder. I'm going to open up my laptop and start writing a proposal. Okay. And when they do that, a lot of times they find it's very difficult to write their proposal. And the reason for that is they have skipped all the planning steps. So they don't know what their funder's looking for. They don't know, kind of what the program officer is looking for. They don't know the process that for the review process. They haven't really thought through exactly what they will do if they get funded. So it's very hard to describe that in a proposal if you haven't really thought it through. So that's, really important, and, kind of getting you ready to write a strong proposal is actually really going through the planning stage. Okay, so let me just summarize all the steps and then we'll step through these. Okay, so before you ever start writing, here are some of the things you need to do. Okay, Obviously, think about what is your idea, and that idea is going to be informed by your line of research, right? What have you done so far? Where do you want to go? What do you think would be the next step that you can propose? Okay. Then identify likely funders. So who is interested in your line of research, in the kind of project you have in mind? Okay. Identify a specific funding opportunity and program that, basically controls that money that you're going after that fits your particular idea. Okay. So that is really important. And we'll talk more about that. Then, now that you have a funding opportunity, it has a certain amount of money, certain amount of time that's going that it's funding you for, a certain expectations. Now you need to take that idea and craft it into a project. Okay, so a project is it has a clear goal, has clear objectives or aims, it has clear outcomes, and that is really what you need to do first before you talk to your program officer. Okay, so having gone through and understood, your reviewer, you figure out who your program officer is, come up with at least the outline of a project. Then when you talk to your program officer, they can give you much better feedback than if you kind of go in with a very broad, I have this vague idea to do research in this general area. I'm going to figure out this general question. That's not really going to be as helpful as if you say, these are the things I want to do. Then they can start kind of giving you more advice. Oh, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? What's your hypothesis here? And so that's really a big part of getting good advice from your program officer. Okay. Then you want to think about any other things you have to address that maybe are not part of the project, your idea, but are required by the funder. So it may be education and outreach, it may be extension, it may be commercialization plans, it may be dissemination. It can be all kinds of different things depending on the priorities of the stakeholder engagement, of the priorities of the funder. So you have to think about what are the expectations there and what do you need to do to address those. Okay, and as part of that, you may need to recruit additional collaborators. Okay, talk to your pre-award office, let them know you're planning to write a proposal, and a lot of times they can give you all kinds of help. Okay, line up colleagues who are going to read your drafts for you. So you haven't even started writing, but you hopefully have kind of come up with some sort of a schedule. And you can say to that colleague, hey, I think I'm going to have a good draft by November. Would you be willing to read it for me? And by getting on the calendar now, you're much more likely to get, you're more likely to get a yes for that. So that's another thing to kind of, again, think about in advance rather than saying, hey, I have a draft. Can you read it and get it back to me by next Tuesday? Usually answer, how busy everybody is. The answer is going to be no in that case. So these are all the things you need to do before you actually start writing. So clearly that does mean you need to get started early. So, and that is going to be the refrain. And I know it's not always possible, but starting early is usually a sign of somebody who's more likely to be successful than trying to write a proposal at the last minute. And a part of the reason is you need to do your research and you need to prepare. And that's, kind of that requires some time. All right, so let's talk about identifying your likely funders. Okay, so you have a line of research. Okay, and there are all kinds of organizations that fund research. Okay, so there are federal agencies, there are state agencies, there are private foundations, there are industry, there are professional associations, all kinds of folks that fund research. Okay, but so you think, well, how do I figure out, from all this, who I should be talking to? Generally, there are only going to be certain ones that are going to be interested in your research topic. So that's the first thing to do is, okay, which of these funders is interested in the kind of research I do? A lot of times you can talk to your colleagues, you can see what has been funded. We'll talk a little bit about that. Okay. Then there's only going to be certain funders that are interested in the outcomes you have in mind. So let's say you're in social science and your outcomes are going to be policy recommendations. Only certain funders are interested in that. Let's say your outcomes are going to be a new device. Okay, only certain funders are going to be interested in that. Let's say your outcome is going to be a journal article. Okay, certain funders are interested in that. So that will help you to filter down. You have to think about the funder's mission. So what you have in mind, how does that fit with the funder's mission? Let's say you're doing research and education and learning, right? But you're thinking, well, maybe I need to go to the Department of Education, but you're not doing research in formal education. You're looking at, learning that isn't related to formal education. Department of Education doesn't really do much of that. Right. So now you may want to go to a different funder. So again, those are the kinds of subtleties that you need to start to understand. A lot of this you can learn from your colleagues, but also you can talk to the research office. You can look at what has been funded, and they'll talk more about that. Okay, so, and then generally there is sort of a spectrum between how fundamental your research is versus how applied, right? So are you looking at how the cognitive processes through which people process various mathematical concepts? You're looking at the neuroscience, or are you looking how to develop a new a new curriculum to help sixth graders understand particular mathematical concepts that maybe you're going to try out in the classroom? Very different, right? And different funders are going to be interested in that. So one is really fundamental, one is much more applied, and so you want to look for that match. So based on going through this, you can then start to filter out and say, okay, I have a small subset of likely funders for my research. And this is going to be true, kind of in more universally, not just for one specific project, but this is your community. Okay, so you have your community of, in terms of what conferences you go to, you have your community in terms of where you published. There is going to be a community in terms of who wants to fund your particular type of research. Okay, and so now you can really focus in, okay, and really figure out, okay, I want to get to know these funders. Those ones that I have filtered through and say, okay, these are the folks who have money and who want to invest in the kind of research I do. Now I'm really going to get to know them, not just look for a particular call for proposals that happens to fit what I want to do, but really understand them as basically a customer, right? They have something they want to accomplish by funding you, and you want to understand what that is. And that is really kind of a big part of being more strategic and kind of setting yourself up for funding success, is really starting to know your funders and start to be a part of that network. Okay. So when you want to become part of the community surrounding a particular funder, figure out within that funder, where is that pot of money that might want to fund what you want to do, your particular kind of projects, and then become part of that community. Okay, so how do you do that? Well, we'll talk a little bit about doing the research to identify the funder and the program, but also talk to your colleagues, okay, who have been funded. Right? If they say, you know what, I'm doing research similar to yours. I've been funded by National Endowment for the Humanities. I've been funded by NIH and the National Cancer Institute. I've been funded by the Division of Materials Research at National Science Foundation, Department of Energy. Those are all very different kinds of funders. A shortcut, you could do all this research on your own. Shortcut is to talk to your colleagues. And a lot of times they can tell you a lot about, kind of what they're looking for, what their processes are, and so forth. Okay. You want to get to know the program directors. These are the folks who are controlling the pot of money that you're going to be applying for. Okay. And a lot of times, they really welcome you're talking to you, having you, kind of reach out to them. They generally want to get good proposals. It's a lot of work to review proposals and to oversee the whole process of funding proposals. They would rather have good proposals than bad ones to choose from, right? So they tend to be pretty open to talking to you. Now, there are some situations. So for example, if you're talking about private foundations, some of them are a little overwhelmed and they may not be as open, but this is again part of kind of getting to know your particular funders. Okay. If you are finding that you're having problems finding the program director, or even if not, it's a good idea to go to conferences and workshops that are either sponsored by the funder. So National Science Foundation has regional grants conferences. NIH, National Institutes of Health, has conferences. Department of Education, Institute of Education Sciences has a lot of webinars that they do and workshops. Department of Defense, they'll send out their program officers to, kind of to different universities and hold little kind of a little seminars about what they're looking for, and so forth. So again, this is part of getting to know those folks, being part of the network. Okay, you can subscribe to RSS feeds or email alerts at most of these funders, so you get news. And when there is a new initiative coming down the pike, when they are looking for information from the community that's going to inform a new program or a new solicitation, a new call for proposals, you'll get that, right? And that's really important. That tells you a lot about what's going on. So again, you can see we're not just saying, hey, here's a call for proposals, let's start writing the proposal. Let's get to know that funder. Let's get to know what they're doing, and let's get to know who we need to be talking to within that funding organization. And for many of these agencies, you can volunteer to review for them. Okay, so this varies as how open they are, but the more you know the program director, the more you apply, the more likely you're going to be invited to be a reviewer if they do peer review, which most of the funders that we're going to talk about that fund academic research do peer review. So that is hugely helpful. Now, some funders are really open to having new people come in. So, and National Science Foundation is really open to that. National Institutes for Health has a special program for early career reviewers, and we'll talk about that. Some of the other agencies, it's much more being part of the professional organization. So you get invited to be a reviewer, and that again, it means talking to the program director so they know who you are, talking to people who've been well funded so they might recommend you, having a strong program website so that when they look you up, they can see what your expertise is. Okay. All right. And then general, keep your ear to the ground. Things change with funders, and boy, there's a lot going on right now. We're seeing entirely new agencies showing up with Biden being president. So we have ARPA-H, so a new agency that's modeled on DARPA for health and biomedical research. That is just now coming online. So obviously, if that was something that would be relevant to your research, you'd want to know about that. Changes in emphasis for the Department of Energy, changes in priorities for NASA. All those things are things that you need to be aware of. So again, what I'm talking about is kind of stepping back, not being so solely kind of telescoping your attention just to a particular funding opportunity, but stepping back and really understanding the larger context of the funding landscape for your particular area of research. All right, so you've figured out who your likely funder, or probably more than one, likely funders are going to be. So now whenever you're looking at a funder, you need to figure out where your funding home is within that organization. Okay, so generally, and this is especially true when we're talking about federal agencies, they tend to be huge. Okay, and so it's a real challenge to figure out who should I be talking to at this huge organization. And that will vary a whole lot by the organization, because each organization they do things differently, they're organized differently, they review proposals differently, they announce funding opportunities differently. So this is, again, part of you doing sort of your market research, is figuring out, okay, I think USDA is one of my big funders. Now, where within USDA do I need to look? And usually that means, well, here's USDA. Secretary of Agriculture is the head, right? They have all the things they do that have nothing to do with research, right? They provide help for food, kind of the equivalent of food stamps, right? They provide all kinds of services for farmers. They have all kinds of funding for stakeholders, right? But you find, okay, there is this department that has research within it. Now, if I look, they have researchers, they have the Agricultural Research Service, which is employees of the agency who do research. That's not where I want to go, but I do want to get to know those folks. So now I see there's another place where they have a program, and within that, I can dig down and find, here I am. Okay, so that's within the National Institute for Food and Agriculture. This is where I'm going to go. So that requires, again, some digging, and usually your research office can help you with this. Your colleagues can help you with this. It can be difficult to find this all out on your own. Okay. So let's just go into some examples. Okay. NSF, National Science Foundation. Okay, they are basically organized into directorates, and the directorates are kind of based on general disciplinary areas, sort of like colleges at a university. So you got biological sciences, computer and information science and engineering, education. This is your STEM education, human resources, diversity in STEM is one of their big priorities. Engineering, geoscience, math and physical science, social science. So that's a thing that a lot of times people don't realize. They have programs that fund political science, sociology, all kinds of things, behavioral science, economic science. And they have a new, this is new as of this year, technology innovation partnerships, which is much more about translating the results of, of fundamental advances to commercialization and so forth, right? And then the Office of Polar Programs. Okay, so that's their big kind of units. Then within each directorate, those are divided into divisions. Within each division, they're divided into core programs. And generally the core program is where you're going to want to, kind of find your home. Okay, so that is can be a bit of a challenge, and that is work you need to do before you start writing your proposals. Okay, now in addition, because so much of advanced science and engineering and it is actually multidisciplinary, they also have cross-cutting programs that are sponsored by more than one directorate or more than one division. So that's another kind of complexity you have to be aware of. Okay, National Institutes of Health, totally different. Okay, so they are composed of 27 institutes and centers, okay, which are called ICs. And these are links. As I said before, you can get all these slides and the links will help you kind of navigate these agencies. The institutes and centers are basically organized around parts of the body, diseases, technologies, or populations is generally. The National Eye Institute, part of the body, National Cancer Institute, disease, National Institute for Child Health Development, a population, National Institute for Bioengineering and Imaging, I can't remember what the last thing stands for, but anyway, NIBIB. So these are all different, basically organizations, almost like their own agencies in a lot of ways, and what they want to fund in their culture and so forth. So you got to figure out which one fits you, right? And it may be more than one depending on your project. All right. And NIH funds basic clinical translational research. You can get to the organization charts for each of the ICs, institutes and centers here. So that's a link to that. And the big thing is to determine, okay, which IC fits what I want to do. Okay. And then focus on getting to know that IC. So these are, kind of, again, the examples. One thing I want to mention for any of these agencies, particularly federal agencies, is all about the acronyms. So as you are learning about your target funders, you also have to learn the language. Okay, so one big part of the language is the acronyms, and you'll find when you're talking to program officers, when you're talking to reviewers, when you're talking to your colleagues who have been well funded, they will talk in acronyms. So they will say, well, are you going to go to NHLBI or are you going to go to NCI? I think that maybe you need to go to NIGMS. And so you're like, what? So this means, of course, you have to, get to know these things. And it's not hard. You just have to be aware that you're going to have to get to know those to be part of that community. One thing I want to mention, and I think this applies beyond NIH, but it's something to keep in mind. This is a slide from NIH, and the size of the circles, it represents the size of the budgets of each of these institutes. Okay, so NCI is National Cancer Institute, huge budget. National NIAID, National Institute for Allergies and Infectious Diseases, almost as big a budget. Okay, National Institute for Nursing Research, NINR, tiny budget. Okay, and then many in between. The big thing to be aware, and this is true for different institutes within NIH, but also different foundations, different different agencies, is if they feel like their budget is much smaller than the budget of another funder that could fund your research, they generally will try to push you off to that other funder. Okay, so they tend to be, if you are approaching an organization that has a very small budget, they are going to be much more protective of that budget. Okay, so how do you deal with that? Does that mean you should go, for example, if you're going to NIH, you're going to go to NCI instead of NINR? Not necessarily, because the bigger the budget, the more applications that it attracts, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean the funding rate is really that much lower at NINR than it is at NCI. But what you're going to want to do is make sure when you're writing your proposal that it very clearly fits within the purview of what NINR sees as their territory. Okay, they define this is what we fund. And they're not going to overlap with NCI. They're going to try to very clearly define this is our territory. And so when you're writing a proposal, you want to write a proposal that could only fit in NINR. You want to make it very clear, this is an NINR proposal, not an NCI proposal. Because what happens if they see, oh, this could be funded by National Cancer Institute, they're going to kick it over. They're going to say, oh, no, this should go to National Cancer Institute because we have our tiny budget. We only want to fund things that are really wouldn't be funded elsewhere. The reason I bring this up is not just for those of you going to NIH, but true even within agencies. So this happens a lot with NIH versus NSF, National Institutes of Health versus National Science Foundation. If you are doing research in social science, biological science, engineering that has healthcare implications, okay, and maybe you are thinking, I think I'll go to NSF on this. Remember, NSF, when you look at the budget of NSF, it's sort of like, you know, NIDA versus NCI. It's tiny compared to NIH. And so if your proposal looks at all like it could be an NIH proposal, they're going to kick it over. They're going to say, in fact, a lot of times NSF will kick it over without even reviewing it. They'll say, no, this is an NIH proposal. So again, if you are in that situation where you could go to both places or you're doing something that has relevance to biomedical or health issues, you want to write a very clearly NSF proposal. And we'll talk about what that is, but you just want to make sure it clearly fits. If you're going to NIH, again, you know, you can write it differently, but you need to understand how they're different, and they are different. And there are even kind of some gotchas there where, and you know, where you're kind of, you can inadvertently signal, well, really, I'm an NIH person, but I just kind of put on my NSF, you know, costume and came in here to try to get some of your money. So you want to be careful about that. And so that is something to always keep in mind. Same thing, going to a small foundation versus a large foundation that might have some overlap. All right, for NIH, the way they do things is a little bit different. So if you're going to most funders, not all, but many funders, that including National Science Foundation, you will find a program, that's a pot of money within a division, which is within a directorate. That program officer controls that pot of money. That program officer oversees the reviews, the peer reviews, and helps decide who gets funded. Okay, it's all within that particular program, which is basically organized around a scientific kind of topic or region, atmospheric chemistry, or you know, or catalysis, chemistry of catalysts, right? That kind of thing. Well, if you're going to NIH, it doesn't work that way. So the reason I talk about this, even though some of you may have no interest in NIH, is just to illustrate how different funders can be and how you really got to get to know your funder. So for NIH, you put your proposal in, it will go to the Center for Scientific Review. Usually, not everything does, but most things do. Most proposals do. Okay. And it goes to the scientific review officer, who is a scientist. They then determine which study section, which is a panel of your peer reviewers who are organized around an area of an expertise, a scientific area. Okay. And they will say, oh, this is all about some sort of behavioral, you know, kind of, you know, the behavior of addiction or something like that, right? So I am going to send it to that study section. They will then review it for the scientific merit and assign a score. Then only those applications that score pretty well will then go to the institute or center. So National Cancer Institute, National Institute of Health, or National Institute of Allergies, Infectious Diseases, and so forth. Okay, they're the ones with the money. So they have separated out the peer review processes in this organization, SCR, Center for Scientific Review, and then the folks with the money are the institutes and center. So they will then look at the applications that scored well, and then look at which ones really align with our priorities, and then they will decide which ones to fund. Okay, so what that means for you is you have two audiences. You have the study section, and you have the institute or center and the folks there. So again, very different. You need to know that from the beginning. Great thing about NIH is you can actually look up who's on the study section. So you can request a study section. You can talk to the program officer at the institute or center. You can request a particular institute and center. So that is really helpful. Most other funders, you can't do that. You know which program you're going to apply to, but you can't look up who's on that, who's going to be on that panel. Usually it's an anonymous review. So again, very different processes, just different agencies, different ways of doing things. All right, for NIH, they have the NIH Reporter, which is a database of what has been funded projects. This is probably the gold standard for any agency. It is wonderful. It is, you can do so much with this thing. You can, you can search on all kinds of different things. You can figure out which program officers have funded projects like yours. You can search on keywords. You can search on funding program officers. You can figure out which study section reviewed your proposal. So it's really powerful. Okay. Now, not all agencies have this, but they have some version. Usually you can look up what has been funded. And this is important, again, to understand what they're interested in, what types of things have already been funded. You don't want to propose a project that's already been funded, obviously. But if you see that they've funded a lot of projects sort of along the lines of what you're doing, that's a good sign. If you look at whichever funding database you're looking at of funded projects for a particular agency, you don't see anybody you recognize, you don't publish in the same places, it doesn't seem to be aligned, you're either in the wrong agency or you're in the wrong part of that agency, depending on how you searched. So again, that's a really helpful tool. Okay. And for NIH, they not only have projects for NIH, they also have projects for the Center for Disease Control, the Agency for Healthcare Research Quality, HRSA, SAMHSA, FDA, and VA. So any of those agencies, if you're thinking about applying there, that can help you determine which program officer you should look for, which study section you should request, all that kind of stuff. Okay, and then NIH also has a report, which is a tool to look up activity codes and so forth. Okay, and all these other kinds of tools. Okay, so I know many of you may not be interested in NIH, but I think these are, kind of, again, it's sort of the gold standard for these funders, but many of these funders have some version of this. So you can look and see at least, kind of how many have been funded, or look and see where, which program officers you should be looking for. And then this is for NIH. They have different kinds of grants. R01s is their big meat and potatoes 5-year grant. R03s are small research project grants. R15s R15s are for institutions that don't get a lot of NIH funding. R21s are exploratory. So again, this is a whole language that NIH uses. You will not see that in other funders, right? They don't say R01, they don't say R03. So this is part of getting to know your agency. Okay. All right, moving on to a different agency. Let's talk about Department of Energy. Okay, so they have, this is an old org chart, but I just like, it's easier to see on a slide, and the people are not the same, but the organizations are pretty much the same. So again, this is a federal agency. It's a mission agency. So these are agencies, again, like USDA, like NASA, like NOAA, like EPA, Department of Defense, where they do a lot of things. They're given a mission by Congress. Only a little bit of what they fund is research. Okay, a lot of what they do are other things. And so when they fund research, it's only because they need the results of that research to accomplish their mission that they're given by Congress. Very different from NSF and NIH. So again, you got to understand what their mission is. You got to get to know them. You got to understand what their needs are and their priorities are. Okay, for Department of Energy, they have the Office of the Undersecretary for Science and Energy. So that's the Office of Science and Energy, OSE. Okay, that's where most research is done except for nuclear. Okay, and then within that, they've got the Office of Science, which is the really more fundamental research, and they have one way of doing things. Okay, so then they have the Office for Fossil Energy. They have the Office for Electricity Delivery and Energy Reliability, EERE. These are much more applied. Okay, so whereas the Office of Science does really fundamental, kind of nuclear physics work, the Office of Electricity Delivery and Energy Reliability will fund research on the design of windows. Okay, so super different. And the way they do things is different. The way they announce funding opportunities is different. Everything is different. So again, you got to get to know your part of the agency and know how they fund things. So again, how do you do that? Talk to your colleagues, talk to the research office. They can really walk you through that. You can do, there's stuff published on this too, and you can go on their websites, but I think the fastest way to get started is talking to your colleagues. All right, and then within DOE, the Office of Sciences, you can see they fund advanced scientific computing research, basic energy sciences. And then when you take in one of these components, so for example, ASCR, which is the science computing research, that will then have a huge org chart also. So again, you got to keep drilling down to figure out who you should be talking to in terms of a program officer. Okay. Department of Education, another example, totally different. Okay, they again, mission agency, they do all this other stuff that has nothing to do with funding research. They do have an organization within the Department of Education, though, the Institute for Education Sciences. That's where they fund their fundamental research. Okay, but they are really focused on formal research, right? And things that research that will inform how to improve formal research. Okay, so not so much neuroscience learning, that kind of stuff. So again, you have to get to know what they are interested in funding. Why are they only doing that? Because that's what the Department of Education is tasked with. They are tasked by Congress with improving formal education in the US. Okay, now there are other parts, Office of Post-Secondary Education. They fund grants, particularly for universities, and a lot of things like scholarships and fellowships and, various kinds of programs to improve equity and so forth. So that might be another place that you would apply. Very different culture, very different way of doing things. And then there's Office of English Language Acquisition. Again, very different culture. Got to get to know that part of the agency. So in general, as you start to figure out where within the agency you want to talk, understand what research areas they're interested in, what motivates their interest, who are the program directors, program officers, and what are their roles, how do they announce grant opportunities, do they accept investigator-initiated applications? Generally, the more fundamental the research that these agencies fund, the more likely they are to basically have a mechanism where they just say, hey, community, give us your best ideas in this particular area. National Science Foundation, a huge part of what they fund are investigator-initiated proposals to a particular core program. NIH, again, that's called the application to parent announcements. A lot of foundations, particularly smaller foundations, also are open to ideas from the community, but they will usually ask you to write a letter of inquiry or something to so they can start to kind of give you feedback before you write a full proposal. Okay, so again, you have to understand your funder, and then of course look at what they funded in the past to see if what you're doing kind of lies within that universe. Okay, and figure out how do you anticipate new funding opportunities. That's another thing that can be really helpful to kind of know where things are going, not just where they've been in the past. Okay, and then I think we've already talked about this. All right. Okay, so I know that was a lot of just information, but what I want to do now is to ask you to see if you can go online and see if you can figure out who is the program officer you're trying to talk to. If you already have a pretty good idea, you say, no, I know I'm going to National Institutes of Health, National Cancer Institute, this particular program officer, look and see what they funded. Okay, if you are going to National Science Foundation, again, go down to the core program level, see if you can find. If you're going to National Endowment for the Humanities, look and see which grant program. They're kind of more organized by offices and look at what they're funding. If you're going to NASA, if you can figure out where they're going. If you already know all that stuff, try to look and see what they've already funded. Okay, does anybody have any questions before we get started on this? I know this is kind of throwing you right into the pool here without having I had a lot of information on your specific funder, so I can help you with some of that if you need it during the exercise. But does anybody have any questions? Okay, all right. Okay, so if you have downloaded, and just as a reminder, you can download all these slides with the links. The link is in the chat, and that will help you to get a kind of a start on some of these agencies. And if there's an agency you really have no idea how to get started with, just send me a chat. All right. So Now, while you're doing that, for those of you going to NSF, which I know usually a lot of people are interested in NSF, I'm just going to go ahead and just kind of walk that through. You can ignore me, just mute me if you want, if you already know what you're doing here. All right, for those who are going to NSF, if you're not sure where to start, go to nsf.gov, and this link is in the slides too. Okay, if you go down to organization list right here, you will find, so that's about NSF, third down, organization list. You will find the directorates and the divisions. Their acronyms are here, and you can usually have a pretty good idea where you might fit. Okay, generally you know what discipline, although there may be more than one. All right, so but let's say, okay, I think I'm in chemistry, so I go to Directorate for Math and Physical Sciences, Division of Chemistry. I click on that. Okay, now I'm in chemistry, so Math and Physical Sciences Directorate. The other divisions are here. This one, chemistry, is the division that's expanded because that's what I clicked on. Then I'm going to go to programs. All right, within the programs here, I can see these are the disciplinary programs. This is the organization that accept investigator-initiated proposals. Okay, so I can start to look and see, okay, I think I probably maybe, and oh, and here the disciplinary research. This part is also, actually, I'm looking at, this is, they've divided this a little confusing. These are disciplinary programs that don't have a deadline. They're trying that out on these. These are the rest of the disciplinary programs that have a deadline every year. Okay, so most of the other divisions don't do this. All right, so that is one part of the problem with NSF, is they, chaos has taken over in terms of, they started, everything was very aligned between different parts of NSF, and now everybody's sort of doing their own thing here. Okay, so let's say chemical catalysis. I think maybe that's where I go. So I click on that, and now I can read about what they fund, right? They have a description. They support experimental and computational research directed toward fundamental understanding of chemistry and catalysis processes. Okay, and then I can say, oh, that looks good. That's probably what I do. Let me find out more. Okay, here are the program officers. There's a number of them. If I'm not sure which one I want to look at, this one says primary email, so this may be the person they want you to contact. If they don't have that, you can look and just see, okay, what did they publish? What's their background? Who is closest to what I do? And reach out to them first. And then I can browse what has been funded out of this program here. Okay, now this whole process only works for NSF. If you're doing NIH, you want to use Reporter. If you're going to Department of Education, you have to go within the IES website. So, and I should point out too, if you're really not sure where to go, on the link I gave you, there is a Who Funds What for foundations, private foundation, and for federal agencies. So pull one of those open, depending on what you're interested in, and they'll give you the link to help you start to navigate the funding opportunities and where you fit. Okay, and here you can see everything that's been funded recently, and I'm going to sort it by start date. Okay, and then you can go in and start to look at the different projects and their abstracts. For most agencies, you can't get the proposals that were funded unless you file a Freedom of Information Act, which is usually not a good idea unless you really are desperate, because it's just considered maybe not good karma to do that, and that usually the PI will know if you did that. It's better to reach out to the PI than to ask for their proposal. If it's a declined proposal, it's definitely not available. Okay, but this will tell you a lot just looking at the abstract. And then of course, if you recognize the person, you can reach out to them. If there's somebody from Clemson, maybe you can say, hey, would you be willing to share your proposal? If somebody through through a conferences or whatever, you can reach out to them and ask if they'd be willing to share their proposal. So that can be a good way. And then you guys have access to a proposal archive, so that's also can be really helpful. All right, so I've talked through your whole your whole exercise, so hopefully that wasn't too distracting for those of you who aren't interested in NSF. So does anybody have any questions after doing that little exercise? I know it's not a whole lot of time. We don't have time for everybody to spend, but there's something just to get you started. Okay, Samuel, can you unmute yourself, Samuel Baxter?
Yes, thank
Yeah.
you. I was looking at NHLBI
Uh-huh.
with their program officers. I couldn't really find it on the website, so I Googled it and I only found, I think, 2. I just wanted to make sure it's not a suite of program officers.
Yeah. So if you're looking at NHLBI, the best way is, and I'm just going to do this really quickly because I know probably a lot of you are interested in NIH. Okay. So if you go back up here, I'm just going to pull up and I just want to point out, I have a lot of hidden slides here on NIH for those of you, and for NSF, if you're interested, you can go into more detail on your own here. Just because of time, I'm not doing that. Okay. So here is NIH Reporter. Okay. So if I click on that, let's see, and then, and then of course that window comes under my chat. Okay, let me pull it over. Okay, so here is my query page. Okay, I'm going to expand it. I know I'm doing this really quickly, but you can spend more time on this, and it's pretty easy. Okay, so let's say I wanted to look at NHLBI. Okay, I can go to Institute and Center here, and I want to search just on National Heart, Lung, Blood. Okay, so there it is. All right. And let's say, do you have maybe some keywords for your research area?
We can say hypertension.
Hypertension. Okay. And I could do all this thing. I could say only, South Carolina, or only Clemson, or I could say only RO1s, or I could say, so there's all these different other windows, but we won't do that right now. Okay. So now I'm going to hit search. Okay, this is all funded, right? Okay, and this is giving me all these different funded projects, okay? And I think by default, these are all active, okay? So I can look at all these and start to look at those. I can also go here to charts. Everybody's seeing what I'm doing, right? You're not just looking at my slides still, are you? You can see
Yeah.
it? Okay, good. Okay, so I forgot, I searched on NHLBI. So if I want to, let's see, I forgot. So if you had searched on all the institutes, it'll tell you which institutes are, fit your thing. So here you can see there's a ton of, you're getting so many hits because of course, hypertension is such a important thing. But let's say you worked on neural mechanisms of a hypertension. You're like, oh, this looks like what I do. You click on that, you can read that. Now go to details on the left. Here's a program official. Okay. And you can view, you can go back and look at what else they funded. There is also I think there was they kind of really changed this recently. And I think there's a way to actually look at different program officers, but I think this is the best way to start to look and see, okay, who is funding what? And then once you find this person's name, you can then Google this person's name, NHLBI, and it'll bring up their page. Okay. And so, but there are a ton of program officers. So I think you probably just weren't, for whatever reason, they weren't showing up. But the big thing is here, you can really start to look and see like, okay, this was a response to this funding opportunity announcement. And this is what they funded. And this is, this is the panel this is a special emphasis panel because this must have been for something that was maybe a little interdisciplinary, right? So it can, you can go through and really start to map out your particular area and which program officers tend to fund your area, which study sections tend to want to review proposals like yours, and start to see where you fit.
Got it. Thank you.
All right. I know it's so I just recently did a workshop just on NIH. I could go on and on about NIH because they do have so many great tools, but in deference to those who are not NIH people, I don't want to spend too much time on it. But definitely get with the research office. They can help you with a lot of this also. Anybody else have any questions? No. Okay, I'm not seeing any. Okay. All right. So now let's talk a little bit more about the next steps. Okay, so now your program officer, you have your idea now of where you want to go and who you should be talking to and what they're interested in funding. Okay, so you've got your idea for your topic. Now you need to translate it into a project. Okay, so that project needs to fit the funding opportunity you've identified. Okay, and it needs to align with what the funders are interested in. Okay, and so it's important to think about, okay, what type of project do you have in mind? And this is important in order to be able to make sure you have a good fit with the funder and the funding opportunity. The reason and I kind of belabor this a little bit because this is a really easy mistake to make, and I see faculty making this mistake all the time, is not having a mismatch. Okay, so first, you want to think about, okay, the project I have in mind, okay, is it fundamental research? Okay, is it focused on gaps in knowledge, right? Do we not know this? Then I am going to, figure this out. It's not just, oh, if I do this, what happens? It's more, why is it happening? I'm looking at underlying mechanisms. What's going on? How is this actually working? That's kind of more fundamental research. Okay. Are you doing more applied research? You're focused more on gaps in capability. We are not able to do X, or this particular thing is not working well. This pedagogical method, this sensor, this photovoltaic cell, whatever it is, right? This curriculum is not working well. How can I achieve a desired outcome related to that specific application? Okay, so that is a really different kind of project than a fundamental project. Okay, some funders want the fundamental project. If you put in an applied project, you will usually get poor reviews. Some funders want applied projects, right? If you put in something that's just basically the only thing that's going to come out of it is a journal article, they're going to say, that's not what we want, right? We want a new sensor. We want a new pedagogical method that you can test, or we want an intervention that you can test. So this is where you got to get to know your funder. All right. And then there are also applying an intervention or programmatic kinds of projects. So I kind of lump those together. So basically, these are really not research. Okay. They are, for example, I need funding for scholarships for students who are underrepresented in STEM, and we want to be able to fund them to improve our diversity, and we're going to help mentor them and so forth, right? So that is a really different kind of project because you're focused on a need. Okay. And you're usually saying, I'm going to apply this proven strategy. We are going to recruit underrepresented students who maybe wouldn't go to college otherwise, or maybe would not be majoring in STEM fields. The reason I'm saying STEM is because the National Science Foundation funds a lot of STEM scholarship type programs, right? And we are also going to mentor them and make sure they're more successful. And we're going to do that. How do we know how to mentor them? We are going to use proven strategies. Okay, so that is a very different kind of project. And again, it just depends on the funding opportunity and the particular funder, what they're interested in. Again, now a lot of times what you have is overlap. We have an intervention in mind. We want to apply that intervention to address a need, but we're also going to tweak it, or we're going to look at how well it works under different, different situations. So we're kind of doing applied research also, or we're doing applied research. We want to come up with a robot that's able to do XYZ, or a sensor that's able to do XYZ, or an improved pedagogical method that can improve this particular aspect of the way students learn. But we also are going to look at some fundamental questions. Okay, so again, a lot of times it's not as neat as this, and the thing you want to know is, well, what should you emphasize? Should I be emphasizing the fundamental research? Should I be emphasizing the applied research? Should I be emphasizing the impact on the need? Should I be emphasizing how I'm going to improve, the tools I'm going to be using? Again, depends on the funder. So for National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health, many of those grant programs, they're really looking for fundamental research, and they will ding you if you put in something that sounds applied. But there are some programmatic kinds of grants that they give out. For some foundations, they're really focused on need. So maybe you can piggyback some research, but you really want to focus on your impact on the need. Sometimes it's the other way. So this is, again, not that there's any one way that's right or one way that's wrong. It needs, whatever you propose needs to serve your research agenda, which usually means getting publications out of it. So you do have to kind of be careful about these kind of not researchy stuff. So, particularly early in your career when maybe you're trying to get publications to get tenure, but still, it's also just about making sure you have the right match with the funder and the particular program and the funding opportunity is asking for. Okay, so to get into a lot more detail here, and I won't do this, I just want to point out, if you're doing fundamental research, generally you're going to have some sort of theoretical framework. This is especially true if you're in, for example, social science. They tend to want some sort of theoretical framework. If you just say, hey, I want to understand X, that's not enough. So a lot of other areas in fundamental physical science, they like to see theory also. So it depends, you know, you have to kind of filter it through your own discipline. If you're in computer science, a lot of parts of computer science are not so theory based. So, but you are focusing on those gaps in knowledge. Applied research, generally, again, gaps in capability, and you're going to have deliverables and performance targets usually, right? If you say, I'm going to improve the efficiency of these solar cells, right? You can't just say improve, you got to say, well, how much? How are you going to determine if that works, right? What are your performance targets? What constitutes success? Okay, that's going to be more applied. And then again, the programmatic, a lot of the challenge here is logistics. I'm going to bring, I want funding to take 20 undergraduates to Antarctica to do research all summer long. Okay, how are you going to do that? What are they going to learn? How are you going to make sure that they are, you know, they pack right? How do you make, you know, all that kind of stuff. So that, you know, that's logistically very complicated. Maybe that's not research, but the reviewers are really going to look for how can you fail logistically. And so you're going to have to focus on that a lot. And then of course, impact. Okay, so if it were on students, what, you know, what are you trying to accomplish here? And then what are how are you going to measure if you were successful? Okay. So for example, fundamental research might be understanding the role of prolactin and reproductive cycles of deer, that you're understanding fundamental what's going on within the body of the deer. Okay. Applied might be taking your understanding and developing a long-acting contraceptive that for deer based on manipulation of prolactin levels. Okay, so that might be really helpful for dealing with losses, you know, in agriculture, or dealing with impact on, you know, at the Department of Interior might be really interested because they have an impact of too many deer in a particular area, and you're going to develop that. Or intervention is, okay, we have this contraception. We are going to have a project to reduce deer population growth in Sequoia National Forest using this long-acting contraceptive. We're going to determine how well that works. We may piggyback some applied research on here, but maybe because of the particular funder is the Department of Interior, they would just want to know, how are you going to reduce deer population? Maybe we want to emphasize the intervention part of it. Okay, so now we've got an idea of what, you know, kind of what we want to do. So let's think about positioning yourself to be competitive. Okay. So one thing to think about when you're thinking about your project, and you've got this, you know, idea for what you want to propose is, you know, am I ready yet? Okay. So a big question is, how far along are you on this particular topic? Okay, so are you still at the exploratory stage where you are really kind of dipping your toe in the water? You're saying, if I do this X, what happens? If I, you know, I have an idea for a new way to make, you know, I'm a material scientist, so I always go back to materials examples, to, you know, to make carbon nanotubes that stand on end and do X, Y, Z. And I think that will really, you know, end up with, I can use that as a coating. And I think it'll be a really neat idea. That is really early. I haven't done it yet, right? I have this idea. Or I want to subject a cell to these, you know, ultrasonic vibrations and see what happens. I want to see what the attitudes of people are after a natural disaster in terms of whether or not they should have evacuated. Okay, that kind of thing. Usually that is really considered the exploratory phase. This is very early on. You really are just starting to kind of collect information. That is usually too early to write a proposal. Okay, generally they are going to want, either if you're talking about fundamental research, which many people in academia are doing, is they want to see some sort of a hypothesis, a mechanistic hypothesis. I think, you know, I did this work, I found this thing, now I have a hypothesis for what's going to happen next, right? Or why this is happening. It may be that you are doing more applied research and you say, I have an idea for this, well, for how I can make this sensor that's so much better, or this coating that's so much better, or this, you know, new pedagogical method that's so much better. What evidence do you have? right? If you have no evidence, you just have an idea, usually that is too early to pursue funding for it. These do not really review well. Do you have publications or preliminary results that show this is likely to work, that this is not just an idea that's going to go nowhere? And if you put yourself in the place of the funder, think about how you would feel. You have this money. Okay, someone comes to you and they say, write a proposal. They promise all this great stuff. There's no real evidence that they can do what they say they do, but they say, trust me, I can do this. Boy, I have this great idea, right? You give them the money, they do their best, and they come back and they say, that didn't work, sorry. That's it. You have no recourse. This is not a contract. This is a grant. Basically, you've just lost that money, right? That nothing came out of it. So that is why there is a tendency for reviewers to be conservative. It can be very frustrating because sometimes you have great ideas, and you need some funding to get the preliminary data to show it might work. Okay, so there are funding mechanisms that are specifically for these kinds of projects. We'll talk about those in a minute. For the exploratory, high risk, high payoff ideas, they're smaller amounts of money because what they're wanting to do is help you get that preliminary data. But what you don't want to do is say, I have this great idea, I'm really excited about it, I have no evidence, and I just want you to give me money to see if it'll work. That won't work. Okay, so this is where you want to be a little more strategic and say, okay, I need to step back, I need to get that kind of get some preliminary results. If I have not done anything like this before, I don't have a track record, I need to get publications out showing I can do this. Okay, because that is the only real evidence that I can do what I'm promising to do. A proposal is full of promises, right? But you got to have some evidence, and that evidence is publications and preliminary data. Okay. If you are thinking more on the intervention side, so you're saying, I want to do this intervention with homeless, homeless families, and I think, this way to help them, get out of the, kind of move from being, not being homed, then, you would need some sort of evidence usually. What is your evidence that this approach will work, right? If you have a new idea. So again, this is all about having that track record, and that preliminary, those preliminary results. Okay, so preliminary results in general, I mean, this is always a challenge. Okay, because sometimes people say, well, I feel like I have to do the project before I could get funded for the project, right? But that's not true. You just, again, have to think about it in terms of what evidence do you need, and you can be pretty targeted about the evidence to address the concerns of the reviewers. And it will depend on the project what that evidence is going to be, or what the challenges are going to be, what the reviewers are going to be concerned about. Okay, so what can preliminary results do for you? They can provide evidence that support your premise. So I have a premise. I am saying I think X is the way things are, and based on that, I'm going to have this whole project. Well, if there is not enough evidence that is the way things are, then you're going to need some evidence. Okay, they can be evidence can support hypotheses, right? So I proposed to test this particular hypothesis, but usually they want to see some kind of evidence that the hypothesis is actually going to be valid. It may be to support your approach or methods, right? So I have this idea for a new way to do X. What evidence do you have that it's actually going to work? Or I'm going to have to extract this protein, or coat these nanoparticles, or do whatever. If I've never done this before, it would be nice to have publications showing me doing that. But if I don't have that, maybe I want to get preliminary results showing, yeah, I can do this method. I can coat these nanoparticles. I can recruit these families from the homeless shelter and track them. Okay, and then that's part of that expertise and skills. Okay, so then that kind of poses the question, how much preliminary data do I need? Okay, well, unfortunately, like many things, the answer is it depends. So it depends on the particular discipline. So if you are in a field-based discipline or a lab-based discipline, okay, a lot of times they tend to want more preliminary data. And I think that's, just because there are so many ways your project can fail, right? If you've never gone to a particular study site, you're going to go to Canada, north of the Arctic Circle, and you have never been there and you've never done research on permafrost. Well, obviously there are all these things that could go wrong. So they want to see that you have done some of this work. If you are in a lab and you're trying to extract a particular protein or doing something difficult, they usually want to see a lot of data to show you can do it. Okay. If you are in more fundamental computational fields, a lot of times they just look at what have you done in the past? Fundamental math. They look at your publications usually. So again, this is where talking to your colleagues will help you determine how much preliminary data is going to be expected. Another thing, independent of discipline, and it is basically how risky your idea is. If you just have a crazy idea but just might work, you're going to need more evidence, right? That's, there's so much of a opportunity for failure here. And again, reviewers, funders tend not to want to lose their money, right? And they tend to, even if you have a wonderful idea, they're going to be skeptical. They want to get some evidence. And so the riskier your idea, more evidence is going to be required. Okay. How strong is your track record? So we've already been talking about that. If you've never done this particular method before, you've never worked with this population, you've never done gone to this study site, obviously that's going to be a challenge, a concern. And so you want to show that, yeah, I can do this methodology. I do have access to the population and so forth. Okay. And then kind of separate from risk is just, are there potential showstoppers? Overall, your project might not be that risky, but if you have some step where, if you can't do that and it's early in the project and everything else will fail, reviewers hate that, right? Because again, that increases the chance that your project's going to fail. And so they are going to want some kind of, evidence that that's not going to be a problem, that you have a workaround if it doesn't fail, or that it's not likely to fail. So again, think about that in terms of what is going to concern those reviewers and what evidence can you show. Again, being targeted, not having to do the whole project on your own, but being targeted to show, yeah, here's some good evidence that will convince people. Okay, so this is a chicken and egg problem, right? So if you are in a situation where you say, well, I do have this high risk, high payoff idea, I'm doing, exploratory data, I need funding to get preliminary results, I need preliminary results to get funding. Okay, that is a challenge. It turns out that a lot of funders do have grant programs particularly for this situation, and that is because they have found that this problem of the reviewers being so conservative that a lot of really good ideas aren't getting funded. Ideas that can really make a difference are usually by nature high risk ideas, right? And so that they have tried to deal with this by having these special kinds of grants. Okay, so for NSF, it's called Early Concept Grants for Exploratory Research, EAGR. It's a separate mechanism. You talk to the program officer, you pitch your idea. If they think it's appropriate for EAGR, which usually means you need preliminary data, you couldn't just put in a regular proposal because you need funding to get preliminary data, then they will tell you, yeah, write me an EAGR proposal. It doesn't get reviewed by your peers. It just gets reviewed by the program officer. Okay, and they decide whether to fund you or not. So if you get through that gate of getting permission to put in a proposal, you're in pretty good shape. So that is one possibility. A lot of times, if you apply towards the end of the fiscal year, is the end of September, then they may have some money left over. They don't spend it by the end of the fiscal year, then they lose it. So the program officers are more motivated to give people, they give out smaller grants, and EAGRs are one of them. Thinking about the timeline, usually that means you need to be talking to them in the spring about EAGRs. You can apply anytime though, but that's kind of a little insider tip is thinking about talking to the program officer so you can time things towards the end of the fiscal year when they know how much money they have left. Okay, for NIH, they have the R03s, which are for small pilot projects. R21s are for exploratory research. Department of Education They have the Institute for Education Science. They have exploratory projects. USDA, National Institute of Food and Agriculture, they have exploratory projects. So whatever they know for other funders, the Congressionally Directed Medical Research Program, they have what they call IDEA grants. So there are a lot of these kinds of funding opportunities out there. So once you determine who your funders are, if you are in this situation, just look and see if they do have a particular kind of grant for this situation, because many of them do. Another thing to think about is, do you need institutional support? Okay, so there are a number of kinds of institutional support that you may need to line up before you write your proposal. Okay, one is letters. Particularly this is true if you're doing those more programmatic grants where you're going to bring students in and for a research experience in the summer, or you need for scholarships or for a big study abroad or whatever that is. Usually that means you need institutional help, and kind of, even if it's just having an office and having help with driving the students around, that kind of stuff. So they a lot of times will ask for a letter. Okay, so it may be a letter from your chair, it could be a letter from the dean, could be, depends on what it is. For large grants, big centers, they usually want some sort of a letter like that. And also for a lot of these early career grants, they want to see a letter that says how the department chair is supporting you, that kind of stuff. So if that's the case, you want to put that high on your to-do list. Okay, another form of institutional support is cost share. So cost share is more common. Arts grants usually require cost share. The mission agency grants, like the more applied Department of Energy grants, USDA grants, a lot of times require cost share. Things where there's a lot of industry people applying, or teams with industry, a lot of times they like to see cost share there because they want to see the various companies that are going to benefit from the grant have some sort of skin in the game. So there are different funders that want cost share. Many don't. So most NSF grants don't require cost share. Most NIH grants don't require cost share. So it depends. But if they do, what that is you are saying, I need $2 million to do this project. Okay. Some 20% of that is going to come not from this funder, but from some other source. Okay. And that may come from just a budget, kind of a budget allocation within from Clemson. A lot of times there are accounts where they take that from what they call the indirect. So they have money that comes in with each grant, and they can put some of that back. It may be that you have other sources of funding besides that from non-federal, for example, sources. It may be for some foundations, when they require cost share, a lot of times they will accept what they call in-kind cost share, which is like volunteer hours, that kind of stuff. So again, this is where talking to your research office can help you to determine what is required, what do you need to do to line this up, but you want to start working on this early. So, and then just could be more logistical support that you need, not cost share, but just space, or help with, with wrangling students, or help with arranging housing for students, that kind of stuff. That's another thing where you may need to start talking to them early about that. The big thing here is, don't wait till you have the proposal written to start working on this. Start this early. It will push everything a little, kind of earlier in terms of timeline, because a lot of times you need to know what your budget's going to be so that you know how much cost share you have to acquire, because it's percentage of the budget. But you're much more likely to get cost share if you start early and you work through the process set up at Clemson, versus if you are running around 3 days before the proposal due trying to get cost share. So this is something that, if it's required, usually universities don't have a problem with providing it. You can't just voluntarily say, I want cost share. That's usually not something that universities look fondly on, but definitely, this is something that is part of doing business and getting a lot of kinds of grants. And you just need to give yourself plenty of time and work with the research office to get that arranged. Okay. And then think about, okay, do I need collaborators? Okay, so a lot of times it may be a no-brainer. This is a multidisciplinary project. I need somebody who has backgrounds in these different disciplines. Obviously, this is going to be a team project. But it could be that you just have, you need one particular set of expertise, that you know there's a gap in, you're moving into a new area, you need help with that, or you need somebody who just has connections to the agency and understands the agency. So a lot of times that's true, for example, Department of Defense, Department of Transportation, places like that. A lot of this is kind of knowing what the needs are. You are, proposing research that has to be aligned with what the agency is trying to accomplish and what they need. That's what mission agencies are all about, right? They're funding research just to help them accomplish their mission. So if it's Department of Defense, if you're going to the Office of Naval Research, you need to know what the Navy is trying to do and what they need. And a lot of times having that collaborator who already is plugged in will help you with that. And then, the big thing though is whenever you're building a team, if you're bringing in a collaborator, be really clear about what their role is and what expertise they're bringing, because you're going to need to justify that when you're writing your proposal, and you're going to want to make sure that you're really integrating your team. You're not just sticking in a paragraph from somebody, because that really shows, and it's very it makes the reviewers question whether you're really going to work together. Okay, so make sure each of your collaborators has a clear, defined role and expertise. If you're a junior person, try not to have somebody overlaps with your expertise too much, because then you look like you're just an assistant to the more senior person. So you want to be careful about that. But as a junior person, a lot of times it's a good idea to have a collaborator who has expertise and a track record. You just want to make sure that their expertise is complementary, that you're not looking like you're still basically in student role. You make sure your budget is allocated based on what the needs are in the project, not just on the number of researchers, right? You don't just split the budget 4 ways if you got 4 people on this. If one person is going to Antarctica to do field work and the other person's doing computer modeling, they need different levels of resources. And the reviewers will really notice if you don't, if the budget doesn't reflect that, okay? Discuss with your team what the resources are going to be, and the budget is going to evolve. Usually whenever you have a team, you're going to be way over budget. The first time you do your budget, you're going to have to do iterations. Be really transparent and discuss what you think the outputs are going to be from the project. Okay, and just make sure that when you have a team of researchers, everybody should benefit. This should serve everybody's research agenda. They should get publications out of it. You don't want a situation where one person feels like they're really just kind of serving the project and not actually getting to do anything that's going to benefit their own research. Okay, big thing, communicate. Talk, the whole point of having a team is they should be bringing new perspectives and expertise to the team. But if you only talk by email and just have everybody stick in their sections, that's not going to happen, right? You really do have to have a conversation, and multiple conversations. And the more different your disciplines are, the more you need to give yourself time to make sure everybody understands everybody else's research, they understand their perspectives, and you make sure that the proposal reflects the fact that you're working together and learning from each other. You're not just cobbling together a Frankenstein proposal with all these pieces from different authors. All right. Okay, so I think the best way, we were talking earlier about identifying who your program officer is. So that is the person who is controlling the pot of money from which the grant you're pursuing will come, right? And so best way, I think, is to, kind of figure out your project, at least the large, kind of the overall, what your goal is, what's your main approach, your aims. If you're going to NIH, write up a specific aims page. If you're going to NSF or most other agencies, write up a few paragraphs that describe your project, okay? And put this in a short email to the program officer, okay? And usually what I suggest is at the beginning, say right at the top, I am planning to submit a proposal to your program, right? Below is a short overview of the project I have in mind, okay? Is there a time I can talk to you? That's all you want to say, right? So try to Zoom or, maybe in person if you're going to be, where they are. But don't ask them anything about the project. Don't say, does this fit or whatever, because then it'll just be an email exchange between you and the program officer. And usually they're not very forthcoming. They'll just say, yeah, that fits my program, or no, it doesn't fit my program. What you want is a conversation. So just ask, is there a time I could talk to you? And you can say, I'm available, Tuesday, Thursdays from X, Y, and Fridays all day or whatever, right? if you do that, then they're much more likely to either call you right then or say, no, let's Zoom. I'm available next Friday or whatever. And then you can discuss with your project with program director and get some really helpful feedback. You can ask them, does this fit your program? Does it fit this particular solicitation? How's the proposal going to be reviewed? What will the background of the reviewers be? If you're going to NIH, you can ask them which study section should I ask for? What kind of grant? Is this more of an R21? Should it be an R1? If you're going to NSF, you can say, well, what do you think about, I see that this program is somewhat interdisciplinary. What kind of backgrounds do you think the review panel will have? And then the big thing is allow the program officer to actually give you recommendations, give them time to talk and listen to their advice. Okay. So you don't want to spend the whole time talking. You want to, kind of give them a chance to give you your kind of feedback. So basically make it a conversation. If you're going to a mission agency, I know a lot of people, if they're going to Department of Defense, DARPA, Department of Energy, some people even kind of come with more than one project in mind, so, oh, you don't like this, how about this? But in those cases, sometimes you have the program officer say, well, actually, we don't like this, but I can see you do this. Can you do X? Because again, they tend to be much more directive because they have specific needs. If you're going to NSF or NIH, they're going to give you more kind of scientific advice. You didn't talk about what's your target here. You're talking about your aim 3 is too speculative, that kind of stuff. But you only get that if you let your program officer talk. Okay. If you have 45 minutes with a program officer and you spend the whole time talking, you're not going to learn. Right? This is not about selling your project to the program officer. Most of the time, they're not even the ones who are going to do the first review. It's going to be your peers. It's going to be a peer review. So you want to learn. You want to give them enough information that they can give you feedback, but you don't want to spend the whole time talking. And this is one of the things when I talk to program officers, one of their biggest pet peeves is this issue of I have time with a PI and they won't let me talk. Right? They won't let me give them advice. They just talk. And sometimes this is, I think, nerves also. Sometimes when I'm nervous, I talk too much. So I think it's a good idea to practice, right? Do your elevator pitch, discuss your project, so that you can get it down in 10 minutes and do that with your colleagues, with your partner, with your friends, with anybody, right? And so you have practice, kind of going through things relatively concisely so that then you do have time for them to ask you questions and give you advice. Different program officers are very different. Some, just like faculty are very different, right? So some are voluble and they, love to talk and they give you advice and tell you all kinds of stuff. Some are going to sit there and just read the solicitation to you and say, yeah, no, this counts. Yeah, this fits, this doesn't fit. Some are really opinionated. Some are very like, oh, well, whatever. So, obviously, you may or may not be that helpful to you, but it's always a good idea to reach out to them. Even if you don't learn that much, because then they know you and they know you are going to be putting a proposal in, and that's always a good thing. Okay, so it's not just about you learning from them, but also just you're showing up and showing your interest and kind of describing your ideas to them. Okay. Any questions about talking to the program officer? Anybody have any experiences with that? Anybody have any good or bad experiences? Okay. All right. I see a couple people. Okay. So Matt, do you mind unmuting yourself and just saying a little bit what your experience was?
Yeah, I have spoken to a number of program officers over the years, both in the way that you've suggested, reaching out and then having a phone call or stopping by their office in DC, or alternatively on grant panels. When serving on grant panels, that's been a really useful way to interact with them and have those conversations and chats. So yeah, when I first started at Clemson, I've been here for a while, but when I first started, it was really nerve-wracking to to call them up. But yeah, I think the advice to, I think what I did was just send a really quick blurb, a title, maybe a 2 or 3 line description of what I was thinking, and ask if they would be willing to take time to talk with me about it. And yeah, it was really effective in terms of directing me toward a particular panel, for example, in NSF, or encouraging me to focus on particular language at USDA, for example, and kind of hitting, you've talked about it with USDA, the idea that it needs to be more applied, but it's in the particular programs, it wasn't something that was immediately applied. It was 5 to 10 years down the road. And so really getting some of the language that wasn't in the program description from that was very useful.
That's a really good point. Is sometimes, a lot of times there's stuff that they just don't even tell you. It's sort of, kind of implicit expectations. And a lot of times that's how you find out about that. So I think that's a really good point. I think Sidomir, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. You said you also talked to a program officer?
Yeah, I mean, it was just, and yeah, you were close to pronouncing my name. It's yeah, we, when I was applying for NIH grant at Indiana University, we reached out to a program officer. We initially thought to submit a proposal for R03, and program officer actually indicated that it's a much bigger project and we should probably do it in R21. But that was kind of good thing, bad thing kind of a thing, because the deadline was approaching fast and we had to switch our entire research design, which wasn't really something that we felt comfortable with doing. I mean, we did it, but the reviews were not that great, I have to be honest.
Yeah, and sometimes it's hard. I mean, that is I think the advantage of trying to talk early and just thinking about it all over the long haul, because sometimes one particular project, it may be too late, or they may not be as helpful, but learning, like, some of the, this issue of scope and making sure you're not proposing too much for the particular kind of grant you're going after, all that stuff, and understanding what the expectations are for your agency, all that will help you in the future, even though it may be a little late for a particular proposal. But that's a really good point. Anybody else have any experiences? Has anybody had an experience where they reached out to the program officer and they never got anything back? They got crickets. Nobody? So this is a common problem. And just to put it in perspective, I was talking to a program officer recently, and he said that, he says, well, I got to go. I got 300 emails in my inbox for today, right? So it's not that, and he's trying, I mean, what he does, if this guy is a really valuable program officer for NSF, and what he does is, he will get an email, and if he wants to talk to somebody, he just picks up the phone and calls them right then, which of course gets there. Somebody sends an email, and then 3 minutes later, your phone rings, and you're the program officer on the phone. So that's I think he enjoys kind of tweaking people that way. But he's a very valuable guy and likes to talk to people. So if you don't get response, just give them the benefit of the doubt. Think, okay, this person probably is overwhelmed. If it's, for example, near time when there's going to be panels, they may be overwhelmed with that. And just give them a couple of weeks. And if they don't respond, just send them an email as if you've never sent it, to get your email back on the top of the inbox, and do that a couple times. And then if that's not working, then you may have to go to somebody else. It may be this person's overwhelmed. It may be they're not very good about keeping up with email. It may be they're something else is going on. If you're going to mission agencies, that can be a challenge. I know Department of Defense, I used to work in the defense industry, so I kind of know a lot more about Department of Defense in some ways, but they have a lot of quirks. And one of them is that they are super, super worried about, about cyber hacking, right? So they, you can, if you don't have most, all military email addresses all end with .mil, MIL. And if you don't have a .mil email address, sometimes your email might get filtered out. You may be sending emails and they may not be getting the program officer. Usually they do try to reach out and make it possible for you to reach them. But if that does happen, if you're just not getting anything, you may need to work around, kind of, again, work with your research office, work with any collaborators who might know that have connections, and see if you can get get in there. Foundations, some foundations are super good about getting back to you. Other ones get overwhelmed. I was talking to program officer for Kellogg, and Kellogg he just said, there's just no way I could respond to everybody, right? And so that you learn that by talking usually to your colleagues who've been funded or know that particular funder, to know, well, can I expect to get feedback? If not, then the next best thing is to talk to people who have been funded by the agency. And that is, there's probably somebody at Clemson who's been funded by Kellogg. So you can talk to your research office that can help look that up. You can talk to them. A lot of times if they've been funded, they've also reviewed. If they do peer reviews, even if it's a foundation, usually they've been, a lot of times they'll get invited to review also, so they can give you that perspective. So it is, it is a bit of, kind of a little bit of creativity, a little bit of just persistence that you have to do sometimes with program officers, but especially National Endowment for the Humanities, NIH, NSF, Institute for Education Science, and Department of Energy. Those are all agencies that are usually really, really want you to talk to the program officer. So even USDA also, I think, in general. So, give them the benefit of the doubt if they're not responding. They probably do want to talk to you. They just may be overwhelmed. Okay. All right. Anybody have any questions about that? I would say, if I were saying one of the biggest mistakes people make is, I would say it is not talking to the program officer. People feeling too, too shy to talk to the program officer. And usually, if they do it, they get over their shyness, they do it, they think, oh my gosh, I wish I had done that earlier. That, that was the best thing I could have done, because now I really understand better what they're looking for. Okay, so producing the proposal. So you're ready to write. Think about involving your office of sponsor projects, giving them a heads up. Don't wait until you have a draft. Go ahead and tell them, because they can, they provide a lot of help for you. Identify your possible collaborators, involve them early. Again, don't just ask for a paragraph. Get them involved in actually planning your project and understanding, and writing your proposal, not just sending you a few lines. Work on your budget in parallel with your proposal text. So you don't find out, you write this whole proposal, and then you go and do the budget and you find out you're twice what you can ask for. The more researchers, the more PIs you have on your project, the bigger that budget is going to get. And it is amazing how fast it can get, high. So you want to make sure you kind of at least know if you're in the ballpark. Okay. And of course, try to finalize your proposal several days before the due date. It's just heartbreaking if you put all this work into a proposal and you miss the due date by a few, or the deadline by a few minutes because there was some problem. You just don't want to put yourself in that situation. If you can get it done on the due date, you can get it done. You can just tell yourself the due date is actually 2 days earlier. Okay, so let's think about the actual proposal. Okay, so the proposal elements, this is typical, for example, for an NSF. I mean, and they will vary depending on if there's a solicitation, they may ask for different things. But in general, most NSF proposals will ask for a 1-page summary, 15-page project description, references, maybe some supplementary documents, bioschedule. I should have updated. That's now 3 pages. Current pending, so forth. Okay, and this is budget justification is now 5 pages. So I should have updated the slide. So you can see, again, that's important, keeping up with the changes. So, but in general, the big point here is there are a lot of things beyond the project description you have to have here. Okay, so you want, this is the meat of your proposal. This is what you're going to spend most of your time on, but don't forget all this other stuff, right? The biosketch, current pending, they have this collaborations, other affiliations forms, and your budget, obviously, and all this sort of stuff. So make a list, because it can be easy to forget things, and with all that other stuff. Same thing, NIH R01. The meat of your proposal is going to be your specific aims, your research strategy section, bibliography, and so forth. But there are all this other stuff you have to work on. Okay. Again, usually your sponsored projects office can help you with a lot of that, the pre-award office. So in general, make that checklist. Okay. Then look at your due date, decide you're going to submit 3 days before then start going backwards in your calendar and set up a bunch of kind of intermediate deadlines. Work with your pre-award folks to find out when do they need things. Just because you want to submit 3 days before doesn't mean that you can give them the proposal 3 days before, right? They have to do stuff. They have to do checks. They have to do uploading. They have to do, you may have to get all kinds of approvals. So ask them, when do you need it? If I want to submit on, October 15th, It's due October 18th. I want to submit October 15th. When do you need everything, right? And they will give you those dates and put that on your calendar. Okay. And then go backwards from that. If you have anything that's not in your control, letters of collaboration, data that you need, sometimes you need, for example, if you're doing something more programmatic, you may need the institutional data about, your enrollment and demographics and so forth. Well, you can't do that. You have to ask somebody else. You want to really think about putting that up ahead, early in your process. Okay. Line up those editors, right? Again, before you start writing. When do they need a draft? Okay, so then that's going to help dictate when you have to get things done, because they're saying, oh, I'm going to be gone to China and, this is due. And, this happens a lot with career proposals. They're all due in the middle of the summer, the end of July. And you want somebody to read it, but they're like, I'm sorry, I'm going to be in China in the summer. So you're going to have to get it to me by May, right? So that would be a good thing to know. And work on your budget and all those other things. And so basically what I normally do is I set up a table. Okay, I'm going to submit early. That means, okay, October 15th, that makes this October 13th, and then just go back and start filling in these dates. And you can go all the way back to when you want to have something to send to your program officer. And if it's a team, you can kind of assign people different tasks. And usually what happens is when you do that, when you do that exercise, putting real dates down, you can be very surprised at how early you need to start. Now, people will ask, well, when do I need to start? And obviously there's no one answer to that, but definitely the bigger the project, the more people on it, and the earlier you need to start, the more different your team is. If you have different people from different disciplines, that's going to require some time. People from different institutions, that means everybody has to do the budget for their institution and bring it to yours. And so all those things will affect what you're going to do. If you're revising and resubmitting, obviously you're not going to need as much time. So, but I would say definitely, you want to start several months in advance. And obviously, there are times where you just don't get that kind of notice. There's some surprise opportunity that really fits what you want to do. You got to jump on it. Then you just have to deal with what the hand you're dealt. But I would say as a practice, starting early, at least doing that background information, talking to the program officer, looking at what has been funded, all that sort of stuff. That is going to allow you time to really think through your project, and you're going to end up with a much better proposal. Don't be seduced by the midnight warriors who talk about, oh, I wrote a proposal in one night and I got funded. Well, and there are also people who their whole financial plan is to win the lottery. It's wonderful when it happens. Don't depend on it. It really works better. People I see who gets consistently funded usually start really early and give themselves time to kind of go through many drafts. Some people even will put a proposal away that they think is ready and let it sit and then pull it out after a few days and read it again. So obviously that means you have to have gotten it done pretty early. I know this is all, kind of ideal, but if you're thinking about the ideal, I would say that that's the kind of thing you want to do, is give yourself plenty of time to go through a number of drafts and really think it through and do that background work. And just in general, too, just remember things happen. So I've had, a PI had a pipe break in his kitchen, right before proposal was due. I had a PI whose wife, the baby came early, right? So that was a problem. And so, as you're thinking about your schedule, give yourself some wiggle room there, because things are not going to go as planned. I hardly know anybody who stuck to exactly the schedule they laid out, but it at least keeps you kind of on track. And definitely you want to give yourself that wiggle room in case things don't go as planned or something unusual comes up. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about the actual writing your proposal. Okay, so we've done all the stuff you do up till now. Now let's talk about the writing part. Okay. All right, so I have an exercise for you. I'm going to have you be a reviewer. Okay, so what I want you to do is I want you to put yourself in the place of a reviewer. So let's say you've been invited to be on a panel. Okay, and usually what happens when you have panel reviews is, each proposal is assigned to maybe 3 reviewers as their primary reviewers, and they are going to read it they're going to fill out the review sheet, they're going to rate it, then everybody comes together either virtually or in person, and then the people who've been assigned the proposals will present their reviews, and then the whole panel will discuss it. Right? So you are a reviewer. Usually there are people who are faculty, for example, and so you've had a full day, right? You have been teaching, then you had to go to a committee meeting, then you had to go pick your kids up from soccer, then you had to go home and get them to, get them through dinner, then you had to get the homework done, then, oh my gosh, I haven't finished making out the exam for tomorrow for one of my classes, got to do that. And I've been assigned 15 proposals for this funder, and I have 3 days left before I have the panel. Okay, so that means I got to get 5 done tonight. It's already 10 o'clock. I've had a full day, and this is you, right? You are grumpy. You are tired. You are wearing bifocals usually, and you are not really wanting to read these proposals. That is really your audience, right? That is who you are. And so you're going to want to get through these proposals quickly. 5 tonight. You want to get some sleep. Okay, so it's going to be fast, and you are really going to be, kind of reading critically. Okay, that is who you are. Okay, so what I want you to do now is I'm going to let me just show you here on the chat. I just posted again the link. Okay, so I want you to decide which proposal you want to review. Okay, so go to this link and see where it says review exercise. I'm going to click on that. Okay, so we have several different proposals. We've got an NSF, which is a more fundamental research proposal. We have a USDA proposal, which is more applied. We should have an NEH, National Endowment for the Humanities Scholarship. So it's humanities. And this is a fellowship, I'm sorry, fellowship for, and this is for writing a book. Okay, and we have an NIH specific aims page. Okay, so what these are is when you look at them, they're just the first page. So the NSF one is the first page of a career proposal, the project description, not the summary, the project description. Okay, the USDA is first page of, I think it's a specialty crops proposal. The NEH, as I said, is a fellowship to write a book, first page of the proposal. Then the specific aims one is the first page. Okay, so when you open it, you'll see a version A and a version B. The first page is version A. Second page is version B. Okay, so what I want you to do, I know this is complicated. All right, decide which one you want to review just based on your interests, right? Then I'm going to set up 4 different panels, and you can just go, and these are breakout rooms. You can go to whichever one you want. So the NSF, USDA, NEH, or specific or NIH. And then I want you to read the first page, the version A, discuss it and rate it. So rate it excellent, very good, good, fair, poor. Just kind of where is it in that spectrum? Okay, you don't have to go into tons of detail on that. And then read version B. So read version A, discuss it, rate it. Read version B, discuss it, rate it. Okay. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Thank you for being reviewers. Let me go ahead and share my screen so we can kind of discuss these different proposals. Okay, so let's start with NSF. We have the most people doing NSF. So I guess my question to you all is, those of you who are NSF reviewers, is how did you feel about that A version? Does anybody want to jump in and kind of describe what they, kind of what the consensus was on the A version?
Okay, well, our group discussed that version A, while the writers clearly knew a lot, they did not convey well the what exactly they were seeking to do, and that the introduction has an awful lot of citations and sort of technical details that probably were a little distracting to the reader. Again, we're not exactly sure what they're wanting to do.
Yeah, but what they want to do is teach you everything first, right? So you can't possibly understand the brilliance of their idea until they have given you a whole lesson in all the background, right? You kind of get how did you feel about that idea as somebody who had a full day and ready to move on to the next proposal?
Yeah, I'm ready for bed. I'm ready for bed right now. Yeah, I read the first paragraph several times, and I was like, okay, but to be more particular about it. And then they jump right into all this background, which was, again, demonstrated their depth of knowledge, but not their ability to convey what they want to do.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think, you know, and again, you know, I think it's one of those things, a lot of times people feel like, oh, I've got to get everybody up to, you know, up to the, you know, where we are and understand everything. And yet you got to remember who your audience is. And they really, if they don't already know, they probably don't want to know. You know, they really have to figure out how to convey things in a way that's understandable, and then you can go into detail. Anybody have any other comments on the NSF one? Okay, how about version B? What did you feel? How did you feel about version B?
Okay, well, this was much clearer. We had a much better idea of exactly what they were proposing to do. People like the use of bold to really draw the reader in, and you know, these terms, what are your objectives or your hypothesis, significance, and use of the figure as well.
Yeah. So what I find a lot of times when we do this in person is I find people in version A there, when they find something like that, the objective or whatever, they'll underline it like, oh my gosh, I've been, you know, I'm sifting through all this detritus and I found a gem here. Right. And oh, here it says what the outcomes are going to be. I'm going to underline that. And if you find that somebody is doing that when they're reading your proposal, you've done a bad job, right? Because you want that to stand out. You don't want them to have to sift through this, particularly, you know, it might be 2 a.m. and they've got several other proposals to read. And so what happens a lot of times is they will just start skimming, you know, at this point. And so what happens, you know, as a result of that is your reviews come back and, you know, you go, boy, these reviewers, they were horrible. They didn't know it, you know, they didn't understand my proposal. They were, you know, they're all idiots. And you know, they even, you know, told me things that were in there. They said they weren't there and they were. Well, what happened there was they just got tired of reading your proposal, right? Because it was just all the main points were buried. And so it's up to you to make it understandable to somebody who is reading this at 2 a.m. and they may not be experts right in your field. And so, you know, the point is, even if they aren't convinced of that your project's going to be a success, they don't give you the best reviews. The reviews that should be focused on the content and the science of what you're proposing, not if, you know, in this kind of situation where they're really just not reading it closely anymore. And that's, you know, kind of where grantsmanship is really important, is make sure you're judged on the right things. You're judged on your science, not on, you know, basically things that they couldn't understand what you were talking about, or they couldn't sift through all the wording to find the main points. Okay, so let's go back here, and those of you who were doing, let's see, the specific aims, NIH, is anybody before I start calling names, anybody want to volunteer to be the reporter for the NIH panel?
We weren't discussing much, but my personal opinion is that, as the previous colleague has talked about it, like version A is pretty much, yeah, there's a lot of information there. Really, I would assume, you know, information that is much needed for describing what they're trying to do. But the version B is actually the one that is more concise and that is more that is having a better flow. Like the first sentence actually, you know, opened up the entire proposal, and I got interested in it, to be quite honest. Also, specific aims were written in a you know, much more concise and logical manner. Yeah, I don't know what else I would say. Like the first proposal I wouldn't fund, the second one I would. Probably.
Yeah, and you know, and you're right, this information is needed. It just shouldn't be at the front. That, you know, that is part of the challenge. It's not that the information is bad to have. This background information is needed, but if you start to bury people in the background before they understand why they're reading, then they lose interest. So that's a really good point. You know, one other thing, and I didn't have time to go into all the detail about how specific aims should be structured for NIH, but one big thing they want is independent specific aims. And the way to do that is to make them knowledge focused, not process focused. And so you see in version A, these are process focused. We're going to measure this. We're going to characterize that. We're going to recreate this. We're going to, you know, to use these various microscopes. So it's much more step by step where they are interdependent. Whereas, and what the result of that is, not only are they interdependent, but being process focused, you have to kind of have some knowledge to understand, well, why are they doing that? Whereas in version B, these are independent aims and they focus on the knowledge. We're going to determine the spatial structure and mechanics of biofilm infections and wounds. We'll do that by doing this imaging, this other stuff, but they're telling you right up front what they're trying to learn versus just saying what they're going to do. And I think that makes one reason it makes it much more accessible. The other thing is they have clear hypotheses, and NIH is all about the hypotheses. And lots of NSF is also not everything at NSF, but a lot of programs at NSF want to be hypothesis based, even the engineering programs. So those of you in engineering, you might think, oh, well, I'm exempt because I'm an engineer. So, you know, though we're all engineers, we can just, you know, talk about what we're going to accomplish, but they want hypotheses at NSF. So that is another thing to understand about your program is what it, you know, do they require hypotheses? Can you just talk about gaps and challenges? And that will depend on what part of, you know, what funder and what part of that agency you're going to and what their, you know, attitudes are, which are very, you know, informed by discipline. So those of you in computer science, not so much hypothesis based, but definitely NIH is all about the hypotheses, and a lot of NSF is. Anything else you want to mention there, or anybody else on the NIH team want to mention? Okay. All right. And those of you, oh, yes, go ahead. Yes.
Well, this is usually a good idea to put your goal first instead of the background, because when writing a paper, usually I would write the background in the first paragraph, but it seems like the good proposals in NIH and the NSF examples usually put the goals in the first paragraph. Is that a good practice?
So definitely for NSF. For NIH, a lot of times they do start with like the medical issue, the biomedical issue, but I see a lot of NIH proposals that start with a goal. I prefer to have the goal first, because I feel it's just much easier to understand what I'm doing, why I'm reading this. But if you do talk about, you know, this is the problem we're trying to address, be really specific. So what I see a lot for people who write NIH, the specific aims, their first paragraph or maybe 2 paragraphs to the National Cancer Institute is, cancer is really bad. Cancer causes all these problems. Cancer is you know, and we want to do things to help people with cancer. Well, you're going to the National Cancer Institute. You don't need to convince them that that cancer is bad, right? You need to focus much more on what is the gap you're addressing, right? You know, it is not understood how this particular mechanism, the cell metastasis works, right? And you know, and this is an issue because it, you know, causes whatever issues in cancer patients. So you can start with that, but I would say again, a paragraph, not half of the specific aims, which is what a lot of people do. So yeah, that's a really good question. I think, you know, too, you can kind of calibrate by thinking, okay, is my goal understandable? If it's really, you know, our goal is to understand some really esoteric thing about the way, you know, some part of the cell works, and you feel like the reviewers won't understand that at all, maybe you need to start with a paragraph to describe why that's important, but still, a lot of times it's pretty obvious. Okay, what about USDA? What did you all think of the A version versus the B version?
Yeah, I think A was just seen as scattershot, disorganized, a lit review with no real purpose, and consequently, anybody reading it would drift really quickly. And B, on the other hand, was well organized and structured. Told a story, and as a consequence of that, really would kind of lead the reviewer into your camp to support your work. And one of the things that we really pointed out was this was nice, not just for the logical organization, the fact that, you know, if you start with A and then you have B, it becomes inexorable, and it really helps the reviewer you're really selling the reviewer that your way is the right way. And so that was a big part of it. The second thing was the signals there. So the underlines that the author used to communicate specific components and really call the reviewer's attention to those rapidly. And again, just a good job of signaling that this author knew what they were doing. And so it predisposes the reviewers to support and get in your camp and become a proactive proponent for you as a reviewer.
That's a really good point. Yeah. And I think, you know, what you want to do is really make things easy for that reviewer, and understanding what they're going to be looking for is part of that, and making it really easy for them to find it. Now, a lot of people will ask me, well, what about underlining and italics and so forth? And, you know, that really will vary. There is a cultural element to that depending on the funder. So for NIH proposals, people tend to underline a ton. To me, almost too much, but that is the culture at NIH, and you see a lot of NIH proposals with a lot of underlining. For NSF, you see, and for USDA and Department of Energy, you see more like bold underlining, but maybe not as much. If you are in other, you know, if you're in the humanities, some social sciences, they don't like that. And so how do you find that out? Well, you find that out by looking at proposals in your discipline and to the funders you're going to. So looking at other people's proposals will kind of help you learn the signals of like what it does a proposal in my discipline to this funder kind of generally look like. And you don't want to kind of overinterpret the signal. Like, no, don't just go by one proposal, but a few. You start to see that, you know. So for example, a lot of people, I've seen people, you know, really get into debates about whether to write justify their their text. And, you know, you can go through all the reasons, and, you know, all these studies have shown if you don't write justify, you have a ragged right margin, it's easier to read and so forth. But the truth is, engineering proposals to NSF are right justified. That is just the culture. Engineers are very rectilinear. They like that nice, neat look. Physics proposals are not. You know, so again, that there's no rhyme or reason for a lot of this. It's just cultural. So that is something else that, you know, another reason to look at successful proposals. And, you know, you can take advantage of the proposal archive that you guys are building. So does anybody have any theories for why, you know, I see a lot of this A versions, you know, when people send drafts of proposals, a lot of times they look like the A versions. Does anybody have an idea why we see some people tend to write that A version?
Maybe rushed. They didn't do it in time.
Yeah, and when they're rushed, they tend to go back to their natural way of writing, which is, does anybody have a theory for what are you all really trained to write? Somebody said it already a little bit. Journal articles, right? So that is really journal article style, is to start with the background. And so I think that's one, so it's really helpful to kind of know, okay, this is my default, and for a good reason, right? This is the way I've been trained to write. But think about that. Who is your audience with a journal article? Your audience is that person. It's not the grumpy reviewer. It's the person who says, oh, I got my kids into bed. I've got everything done. It's 10 at night. Oh, I'm going to get myself a nice glass of wine. I'm going to sit by the fire. I've been wanting to read this journal article because it's something in my field, because I read this journal. I really like this. This looks really interesting. And I'm going to read it to learn, because this has already been done. They're reporting what they've already done. So, wow, this is going to be great. This is a treat. Okay, that's your audience for reading a journal article. Okay, your audience for reading that proposal is not that person, right? They're not reading it to learn. They're reading it to judge you. They're not likely, you know, exactly in your field, and so you know they're having to kind of get familiar with your ideas, and maybe from an outsider's point of view. They're reading one proposal after the other, right? So they're comparing. And they're also looking for, you know, what are you going to do? And then they're looking for ways your project can fail. right? Because again, how do you sift through all these proposals? You look for weaknesses. So that's just a totally different audience, and you're going to have to write in a different style. And so the big thing is just to be aware that you have to fight against your natural inclination to go back to what you are comfortable with, which is journal article style. And you have to learn how to write in proposal style, and kind of fight your natural instincts sometimes in order to be able to do that. Okay, so this all kind of goes to grantsmanship. Okay, so just to summarize, things to keep in mind, if you're open to a proposal and it looks like this, you haven't read a word yet, right? And you're like, feel a feeling of dread. That is not what you want to inspire in your reviewer. You're right. You want to inspire a feeling of, this is basically going to be fun to read. And how do you do that? You do that by making it easy, chunking things up. When you make it easy for somebody to read through probably a complex idea and read it once and understand it. Okay, so headings, subheadings, figures that show that basically that actually show something that's important to the project. A lot of times having a caption that explains the point of the figure, rather than just saying I'm presenting information, right? So rather than saying here is a micrograph of this nanoparticle with this coating, you say this micrograph shows that we have been able to coat this nanoparticle with gold coating to a tolerance of X, nano, whatever. And so you're making a point, right? So that, again, remember that each section you really are trying to make a point rather than just present information. And in fact, I would say my rule of thumb is never make your reviewer think. Tell them what to think, and then you have to back it up. They're not going to just take your word for it, but tell them what your point is. Don't just present information and expect them to be able to put it all together for you. You need to put it together for them. Okay, and that's part of grantsmanship, is making it really clear, and also being clear. What are your arguments? What are you trying to say here? And that will help. If you clarify that in your mind, it makes it easier to write your proposal. Okay. All right. Okay, so figures are really helpful. I wouldn't, you can only do so much, and you will have to be careful with figures because they do take space. But anytime you have information that's not clearly linear, so that's where you have different components that all have to fit together. You have different, maybe you have decision trees, things like that. Having some sort of graphics rather than trying to describe it in text is usually the best way to go. If you have a very complex, for example, decision matrix or experimental design, usually a table is better, right? Or so again, think about the ways that you convey things in a way that's much more friendlier, easier for somebody to absorb than just seeds of text. The headings, subheadings, chunking things up so that it's really clear. You're signaling when you're changing a topic. So big long paragraphs, I would say, are almost always a no-no. If you have a long paragraph, can you chunk it into smaller kind of topics? Bold and italics, judiciously used, or underline, again, helping the reviewer find the important points. And I would say that's especially true with review criteria. So you should have, when you looked at, if there was a call for proposals, a solicitation, usually they list the review criteria. Many funders have like standard review criteria that they apply to every proposal. Okay, and that's what the reviewers are going to be filling out on their review sheets, is those review criteria. For NSF, it's intellectual merit, broader impacts, and then there may be additional ones for a particular solicitation. For NIH, it's a significance, innovation, investigator, and so forth, right? So I have that somewhere, but basically knowing what those are and making it easy for the reviewer to find where you summarize your arguments is really important. So if, for example, how is this innovative, rather than having a, oh, well, I'm discussing the whole background over 2 pages, and then you, reviewer, at 2 in the morning need to kind of figure out what that means, you state it. Okay, what's your main argument? This is innovative because we are the first to do XYZ, or this is using a new model, or this is using this, and then you can go through and you can expand on that, but make it really easy for them to copy and paste into their review sheet what your argument is for how you're addressing each review criterion. And that again makes the life easy for the reviewer. And a lot of times if you do a good job, you can write your own reviews. And I've seen people, you know, say, boy, I explained this and it just ended up right in the review sheet. So make sure you're clear about what your arguments are, and you're not just presenting a ton of information with no synthesis of that information. Also be careful when you're doing graphics, tables, so forth, be careful about tiny fonts. So I see this a lot with graphs. If you have a graph and you take it and you know, something you prepared for a conference that was going to be on this huge screen. So you take the graph and you shrink it down to fit it into a proposal. And so you end up with illegible legends and axis labels and so forth. That's wasted. You know, reviewers, I know, you know, theoretically they can expand, they can zoom in if they're looking on their computer. A lot of times they don't do that, right? So you want to make it, you know, go back and redraw it, just redo the labels. If you have some big, you know, kind of some big image and you have labels on the image, make those sure those are legible. Those kind of things you would think would be kind of obvious, but you know, you've got a million things you're trying to do in writing a proposal, and it can be easy to not really think about that. But that is a way to irritate your reviewers, is have a figure, you know, figure that basically they can't read. And then I mentioned captions. Have a caption that explains the point of your figure. So when I was worked in aerospace, and you know, we would write proposals, and a lot of times we would have, you know, you'd have scientists and engineers reading it, but then it would go up to the generals, right? And what one of our rules of thumb was, if you could read through just the figures in the proposal and read the captions and understand the project, there you were. That was good for the generals, right? Now that's an extreme example, but I think, but part of that was what they called action captions, right? So you needed a verb in that, and that is where you get that idea of saying, okay, this is what we're showing you in this figure, not just, you know, hey, here's a you know, an image, here's a graph. This graph shows X versus Y. You know, no, this graph shows that, you know, you people with this particular socioeconomic status are 10 times less likely to go to college, or whatever it is, right? So process it for somebody who can, so that at 2 in the morning they understand what your point is and what your arguments are. Be careful about long, convoluted sentences with lots of dependent clauses and burying the main idea at the end of the sentence. Reviewers, again, are they reading this? They're tired. It's 2 in the morning. And, you know, if they have to read a sentence twice, they probably won't. They'll probably just skip over it. So make things as easy as possible. Just because your writing is simple does not mean that your science is simple. You know, they understand that, they want to understand what you're talking about, but if you make it hard for them, they may just decide to move on and skim. So make it really easy. Make your, you know, subject, verb, object is a lot of times a good way to structure your sentences, and avoid tons of dependent clauses. Okay. Avoid cognitive taxes. Okay, so remember your poor reviewer, it's 2 in the morning, they're sleep deprived, their IQs are already depressed. And then when you start adding things on there that they have to keep in mind, it makes it harder and harder. Okay, so one of the biggest cognitive taxes I see that people do all the time is overusing acronyms. Okay, so acronyms, every time you read an acronym, you're going to have to mentally translate it. And there are some acronyms that make sense. If it's an acronym everybody uses in your field, and you know your reviewers are going to be the same field, well, that's not, there is no cognitive tax there. They already understand that, right? But if it's something that, you know, where you are particularly finding that you have sentences with multiple acronyms in it, it makes it really hard to read. So for example, this is one: hydrogel beads, HGB, and fluorescent tracers, FT, will be injected into the intermediate scale model system, ISMS. We will then monitor flow of HGB and FT in the ISMS as a proxy for contamination with DEHP and TCP. Okay, so if you go step through, they have defined most of this stuff. We already know what DEHP and TCP is. Okay, we know those chemicals. So, but still, this is really hard to read, right? You've got to mentally HGB, hydrogen bleeds, FT, fluorescent tracer, ISMS, and really, when you think about it, a lot of times these acronyms, they don't save that much space. If you went through and just did a global, search and replace and put in the whole word, a lot of times it doesn't make that much difference. If there is something that you're going to be using over and over and over again, you want to give it an acronym, that makes sense. But really be careful of overusing those because it just makes it so hard for the reader. And again, you'll irritate your reviewers. All right, that's our grantsmanship part. And then I'm going to kind of step through the sections of the proposal. Does anybody have any questions about grantsmanship before we move forward? All right, so let's talk about the proposal narrative, and that can be called different things depending on the funder. So NSF calls it the project description. For NIH, that's the specific aims page and the research strategy section. For Department of Energy, they usually call it, and the Department of Defense, they tend to call it the narrative. And so, but this is wherever you're describing what you will do if you get funded. Okay, now the structure can vary depending on the funder. So they can have different, kind of expected structures. Also, though, if you have a solicitation, right? So a very specific, a call for proposals that is prescriptive, they may tell you exactly how to structure your proposal. Sometimes they'll say, okay, first section, sometimes they'll even put point numbers, point counts. This was worth 20 points. This is worth 10 points. This is worth, you need to address this here, address that. If that's the case, follow that exactly, because that's what reviewers are expecting. And if you decide to be creative at 2 in the morning, you're just going to irritate your reviewer. Even if it doesn't, you don't like the way they have structured things in the solicitation, go ahead and follow it, right? Because that is, the reviewer was reading one proposal after the other and you decide to move everything around, they're just going to get irritated with you, and that's not going to help you with your review. Okay, so for example, NSF, the project description, you have typically an introduction overview. You may have a separate intellectual merit section. You have your background, discussion of state of the art, your research plan, which should be the largest section in the proposal, broader impacts, results of prior NSF support. This is typical. The only things that are absolutely required, the broader impacts and the results of prior NSF support if you've had funding in the last 5 years. And then a lot of the other stuff is, kind of all kind of expected and addresses review criteria. For NIH, that's the specific aims page, the research strategy section, which is different lengths depending on the kind of grant. So R01s are 12 pages, R15 are 12, R03s and R21s are 6. But then they also want a significance section, an innovation section, an approach section. So again, typically that approach section should be the largest section, okay? For Department of Education, Institute of Education Sciences, they have all these different types of grants, types of projects, depending on where you are, how far along your idea is. So for example, a development and innovation project, they require the significance, the research plan, personnel and resources, and then other. Okay, so you can see there are variations, but these are pretty, a lot of the same type of components. Exactly how you title them, exactly what's in each one might vary, but you can see there's a pattern here. Okay. And I think I've already said, if you're responding to a solicitation that specifies sections, follow that. But then be sure and go to the end of the solicitation is where they usually have review criteria. And usually these solicitations that are more prescriptive, that they say, we want A, we want B, we want C, we want D, like that. If usually then they have additional review criteria beyond whatever the general criteria are that the funder uses, that particular funder uses. So, if it is a proposal that has to do with buying a piece of, kind of funding a piece of instrumentation, then they will say, these are the sections we want you to talk about first. What is research is going to be enabled? What are the quality, the characteristics of the instrument you want to buy? What is it, how is this going to help you with workforce training? And then in the review criteria, they're going to talk a little bit about how they're going to judge those things. So go to the end of that, and when you do your outline, go stick where you're going to address each review criterion into your outline sections, because sometimes just as some people don't write the best proposals, some funders don't write the best solicitations. And so what will happen is they will put in the solicitation, we want your first section to be on this, your second on the need, and the next section is on this, on what have you done on this, and so forth. And then they don't tell you to address the review criteria, which are at the end of the solicitation on page 25 or 30 or 40, right? So you need to make sure that you are addressing what the reviewers are going to be looking for, and you do that by going back and making sure that those review criteria, what you're being scored on, you're actually addressing explicitly, and you have that in your outline. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about structure. Okay, so you have your narrative sections. Okay, so we've talked about, kind of having this big narrative, and then maybe they tell you what the sections are. Okay, so for your whole proposal, and then for each section, there are ways to kind of figure out how to approach this. The first is this slow build storytelling approach, where you kind of build suspense. It's like a mystery novel, right? The carbon nanotubes have all these wonderful properties, and their surface structure is, unique in these ways. And let me talk about show you the molecular, the structure, and let's talk a little bit about the properties. And now I'm going to add more about what we've done with them before. And now eventually I'm going to tell you, oh, our great idea is we're going to manipulate the surface properties of these carbon nanotubes so they either bunch up or they distribute inside a material, and that can dictate how the material behaves. Okay. I've finally given you that. I've built up, right? And that's what we were talking about in that A version, where you give all that background first, and you build, and then eventually you tell them what you're going to do on the bottom of page 2. You don't want to do that, right? That is much harder for somebody who doesn't know why they're reading this to absorb, right? They don't have this background. They can't understand, why am I reading about the surface properties of these carbon nanotubes? Or they're reading it, and it's like, I'm a carbon nanotube expert. Why am I reading stuff I already know? So that's the other side of the coin there. Instead, you want to start with the overview. Okay, this is my great idea. This is why this is what's going to happen. So that's what those B versions were. NIH really kind of forces you to do that with specific aims page. If you follow what they're looking for in specific aims, it is the outline of the elephant. It is the map to the rest of the proposal. Okay, many other agencies, they actually can kind of pull you off of that by telling you to give background first, but you want to give that outline first, right? And then you can fill in. Okay, this is our big idea. Now let me go back, and now I'm going to give you more background, and now I'm going to talk about what we've done in detail, and now I'm going to talk about what's going to come out of it, and so forth. Now, that's true for the whole proposal. The whole narrative is giving that outline of the elephant first. But even when you're talking about section by section, give the outline of the elephant first. Right? What are your main points about significance? What are your main points about innovation? What your preliminary data? Tell us in one paragraph what you've done, what you've gotten, and why it's important and why it's relevant to this project. Then go into detail. Okay. And then it's even helpful if you think about your paragraph level, structuring it by talking about the main points and then backing it up. So instead of saying, so-and-so did this, 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 therefore this shows that, okay, that, this approach is feasible, or that, we have this particular problem, right? Instead, you say a number of researchers have found that so-and-so, that this is a problem, or this is significant. Specifically, so-and-so did this, so-and-so did that. That is a much easier, again, at 2 in.the morning. Somebody doesn't have to read through what seems like disconnected facts before they get to, this is what we've, this is why, what our conclusion is. Even though it does make sense logically to build up to your conclusion, as a kind of grantsmanship issue, as a structural issue, it's much easier for your reader if you tell them what your point is first. Then they can read everything, because it's a lot of times not exactly in their area. They understand why they're reading it versus kind of trying to struggle through stuff that may not be exactly in their area, and they don't know why they're reading it. Okay, I've already done that. Okay, so now that was the high level. So now let's talk about each section by section, what you want to accomplish. So and these are generic because, you know, different funders, as I was showing, have different sections they require, and different and solicitations may be somewhat different. So I'm talking generically about what common sections, and they may be called different things. They may be organized slightly differently, but they're kind of, there's a lot of commonality. Okay. So first of all, let's talk about that first, your specific aims, your overview, that first, you know, kind of the outline of the elephant. Okay. So this is where you really want to tell your project story. And it may not be organized exactly the way in terms of the order may not be exactly this way, but it's important to kind of know what all these things are. So generally, and this is generic, so it, you know, you may be a little bit different for your project, but generally you have some sort of a need or motivation, right, with a clear goal for your project. Okay. And then you have gaps in knowledge or capability that motivate that goal, as we were talking about before, about the different kinds of projects. Okay. Then that leads to new knowledge or capability that you're addressing, and with clear either hypotheses or research questions for fundamental research, or challenges or barriers you have to overcome for more applied research. Okay. Then based on that, and that you have what you're actually going to do, you have objectives or specific aims. And usually a lot of times this is where what you're doing is different. It may not be. It may be your goal is really different from what everybody else's is, but a lot of times it may be that you have a whole new approach, and that's where you want to emphasize innovation. And then your significance, what is going to come out of it, your outcomes and impact. Okay. If we're talking those intervention programmatic grants, these are going to be a little different. You're going to frame it differently, because this is not really research in this case. It's more about, okay, we're addressing a need and motivation. We have a gap in resources. We need money for scholarships, right? We have a rationale for what we're doing. We have evidence and strategy. So we want to promote retention of underrepresented students in our calculus class, and there's some evidence that, you know, if we do it, we change the way we teach in this way, or we provide mentorship in that way, that's the way we're going to do it. And so a lot of times you have a strategy, and then you have to back it up with some sort of evidence. You know, is it in the literature? Is it in your preliminary work you've done? And then you have an approach, and then significance. So it's going to be slightly different for those of you doing those kinds of projects. Okay. All right. So basically what you want to do after they finish that first section, the specific aims section, your overview section, is basically they understand your project, in at least the outline of your project. They have a clear, you know, they're really excited by what you're doing. They have a basic understanding of your project. They're convinced your ideas are really great. Why didn't I think of that, right? And they should want to read the rest of your proposal. So this is where you really grab your reviewers, is that first section. And I've heard a lot from people, and particularly NIH, the specific aims page, I've heard many reviewers say, if they read that specific aims page and they're not really intrigued, they just don't read the rest of your proposal that closely. Okay. So you really want to put a lot of effort into that. And I think into that first section, making sure it's really engaging and it's accessible. You can get into a lot of the nitty-gritty of the technical details and so forth. And obviously you have to calibrate depending on the background you expect of your reviewers, but make sure that first section is really accessible to your reviewers, knowing what kind of diversity of backgrounds you expect. And how do you know that? You know that by having talked to your program officer and talking to your colleagues. All right, so then as a big part of this also, you need to put this in the context of where your research is going, or your team's research is. So this is important. A lot of times I'll read proposals where there's nothing about that actual team or the PI in it. It's almost as if it's going to be done by some, it's all in passive voice. It's not clear who's actually doing the work. You really do want to talk about this in the context of where you see this research going, for two reasons. One, you want to mention, kind of how this builds on what you've already done. So that helps you make the argument for why you or your team are the right people to do it. And you also want to make the argument for where this could lead in terms of the big question, the big need, the big challenge you're addressing. Okay, so that helps you strengthen your argument for impact and significance. So you have to be clear about what your project goal is, but a lot of times you want to put this in the context of your larger goal. And again, if you have preliminary work, don't wait until the preliminary work section, which might be 6 pages in. at least give a little bit of, what were your results that make you think this is going to work? Give at least a couple of sentences that kind of tease that right up front, page 1 or 2, right? Make sure that it's clear. If you have some really important preliminary results, you want to state that. Don't wait until, they've read halfway through the proposal before you mention that. One big thing, though, is you want to be very clear about what are the goals you're going to accomplish in this project versus where you're going. A lot of times people will confuse those two things. Okay. So let's step through this a little bit. Okay. First, your goal. Okay. How do you describe that? Okay. Your goal is, after you spent this money, how is the world going to be different? Okay. What will we know? What will we be able to do that we don't know or can't do now? Or in the case of an intervention or a programmatic, what need will have been satisfied, right? What gaps are we filling? Okay, this is really important that you don't overpromise here. You need to be really specific, because otherwise you're going to get yourself in trouble with the reviewers. Okay, and you want to make sure the way you describe your goal, it aligns with what the funder is wanting you to do, right? For this particular grant program, they may have already said what they want, or what their priorities are. And you want to phrase it in a way that aligns with basic versus applied. So if you're going to in NSF, you probably want to phrase this in terms of knowledge. What will we learn? If you're going to Department of Defense, it might be much more in terms of what are you going to produce. If you're doing something that, if you're doing something much more applied, you may talk about, okay, we're at this technical readiness level 3, and we're going to get to technical level 7, right? So again, this is all about understanding your particular funder and what they're looking for, and then framing your project in a way that's clearly what you will accomplish. You're going to be, you want to make sure you're presenting a goal or a project that will accomplish what you're promising, but also that aligns with what the funder is looking for. Okay. So a common mistake people make here with goal is they'll say the goal of this project is to determine the effect of climate change on the Gulf of Mexico coastal wetlands. Well, that is so broad. Can anybody do that with, a $400,000 grant, 3 years or 5 years, right? Can you really do that? That is so broad. That is much more that long green arrow. It's actually probably too broad for that either. That's probably like a whole group of people working for, many careers to do that. What this PI is really going to do is, the goal of this project is to determine how increased water temperature and reduced freshwater inflow projected due to climate change will affect the salinity of the water in the Johnson Bay wetlands. That is what their study site. This is what they're going to measure. This is what they're going to find out. And then this is going to help inform this larger question, that more big green arrow, of the effect of climate change. Right? But make sure you're really specific about this, because you are going to be judged by the bar you set. If you set this really broad, vague goal, 1, you're already going to inspire skepticism in your reviewer. And 2, they're going to say, and I see this a lot in review comments, the PI did not, it wasn't going to achieve the goal she set out with the project she proposed. Right. And a lot of times it's not the project you propose, it's the way you articulated your goal. So you want to be really specific about your goal and make sure that you are stating it in a way that is accurate for what you will actually achieve. Okay, examples. We want to provide a detailed understanding of the roles of structural variation and flexibility in the parvoviral capsid and their effects on receptor and antibody binding and so forth. Right. So again, these tend to be a little bit long because this is very specific what they're actually going to achieve. We're going to determine whether coevolution of plant and pollinator phenotypes promote reproductive isolation and speciation in a classic obligate pollination system. And then they state the system, right? Not just in general. In yuccas and yucca moths, okay, that will have all kinds of relevance to this larger question of reproductive isolation, but they're looking at it in yucca and yucca moths. Okay, we want to understand the mechanisms of microbial toxicity of graphene-based nanoparticles and their effects on the functionality of microbial communities and so forth. Okay. We want to identify ecological soil community management strategies that synchronize soil nutrient availability with sweet cherry tree demand. Okay, we want to provide a focused, a family-focused cognitive behavioral therapy program to 150 teenagers with borderline personality disorder in the Sioux Falls area. Okay, so you can see these are fundamental. Understanding, right? This is new knowledge. Okay, this one is more applied, right? We're identifying a strategy. And then this one is more programmatic, or intervention focused. They're going to apply to provide a service and intervention to this population and address a need. Okay, so again, these are calibrated to the type of funder and what they're looking for and the kind of project they're doing, but they're also being very specific. Okay, not we want to explore a phenomenon. So that's a lot of times a goal people will write, I want to explore this broad phenomenon. Well, it's not clear what you're actually going to get out of that, right? You can explore all day and not learn anything. Another one, and I see this with career type proposals and also with center proposals. So it is, our goal is to become a leader in this field for career proposals. Well, everybody's goal is to become a leader in the field. That's not really what you want to say. You want to talk about what it is that you're going to learn, or what are you going to, what you're going to accomplish. The other one, we want this center grant to establish a center that does XYZ. Again, that's not what you want. You want to talk, everybody wants to get a center grant to establish a center. It's more about what do you want the center to accomplish? That's what you want to focus on. Okay. And then if you are talking about NSF, NIH, you want to be careful about really focusing in much more on the knowledge than on the application. So if those of us in engineering, this is a really important, it's not to develop a new sensor, a new material, a new therapy. It is to learn things, okay, that will enable these sensor we are going to address. We do not understand this particular thing. We're going to learn it. That will then lead to a better sensor, a better photovoltaic cell, a better therapy, a stronger material. Okay. And that is, again, all about framing it in a way that aligns with what, if you are going particularly to National Science Foundation, that you make sure you're focusing on the learning, not just on a particular application. Okay. If you are proposing to model something, just be careful about that. Generally, a model is a tool, not a goal. Now, there are some programs that are just all about modeling, in which case that doesn't apply. But in general, if you say, my goal is to model something, it's better not, that is what your approach is, to model it. What is it you're trying to accomplish with that model? What is that model going to be able to do that you can't do now? What is it going to be able to predict something? Is it going to answer some certain questions? Usually you're better off focusing on that, and you're doing it by modeling things, but your goal shouldn't be just to generate a model. And then also remember, generating a model in and of itself, not always, but most of the time you need to have some sort of validation of the model. Models may reflect reality, they may not, and you need to think about how you might validate that. Okay. All right. So I think I'm going to give this as a homework exercise. Let me see. Do we have time? Yeah, I think we're going to give this as a homework exercise. So what I think, when you're ready, I think you should, think about talking to a partner. And it could be a colleague, it could be your husband or wife, it could be a friend, and actually explaining to them what you see your project goal is verbally. Okay, so explain to them your goal, why, what is the motivation for your goal, what's the gap in knowledge or capability or resources that you're addressing, right? And if you can do that, usually a lot of times that makes it much easier for you then to write it down. Okay, so the big thing is you need to go from kind of, a lot of times you may have a big long discussion. A lot of times if I do this exercise during the workshop, we have maybe 5 minutes for everybody to describe what they're going to do. And then you're going to have to really make it more concise and boil it down to 1 or 2 sentences. Okay, so a lot of times this is where you want to avoid kind of going on and giving all this background, but what is it? How is the world going to be different after you finish this than it is now? That's what you want to be able to articulate. So a lot of times I find it helpful to have your partner repeat it back to you. So you describe it to them, and then and a lot of times they can help boil it down. Okay, so you're saying you want to look at this particular phenomenon and whatever, right? And you want to learn XYZ. Yeah, that is what I'm saying. Okay, now I can write it down. So I think, again, if you find yourself stuck at all, try this exercise and really try to describe it in words, and then you can a lot of times write it down. Any questions about goals? Okay. All right, so the next thing is, what's your science or scholarship? Okay, what is it? What's your basically new knowledge? This is really key. If you're talking to NSF, NIH, Office of Science at Department of Energy, even, a lot of other more applied, projects, they still want to know, what are the barriers? What are your capabilities? What's exciting and new? This is where, you're really making the contrast between, what you're going to accomplish and where things are right now. Okay. And the way you frame that will depend on your research, type of research, your discipline, and the funder. But remember, this is key. This is what excites your reviewers. So you need to really think about, okay, who are your reviewers? Are you framing this in a way that it will clearly, aligns with what their interests are? Okay. And this is especially important for those of you who are maybe working across disciplines. So let's say you are going to a computer science program, and you are going to be looking at self-driving cars and software for self-driving cars. You want to really talk about this in terms of computer science challenges, not self-driving car challenges. These are not self-driving car people. These are computer people, right? So you want to make sure your research questions, your gaps, are focused in what the area they're interested in. If you're going to a engineering and you're talking to self-driving car people, then you might frame it differently. This also will help you determine, where should you be going? Which program should you be targeting? Based on, where is the new knowledge? Where are the advancements? That's what you want to really focus on. This is true too. I see this a lot. For example, biosensors, right? If you're going to a sensor program, you want to talk about the challenges in sensors, not the problem, the healthcare problem that you're trying to solve with the biosensors. If you're going to NIH, and you're going to National Cancer Institute, you're doing a new biosensor, you talk about the impact on the gaps in terms of cancer, right? So you got to keep in mind your audience. So what a lot of people will do, and I see this a lot, is particularly engineers will do that, more applied researchers will do this, okay, where you say, I have a goal, and this is how I'm going to accomplish the goal. I have objectives and aims and outcomes, okay? And they never actually articulate the new knowledge or new capability, the hypotheses, research questions, challenges, or barriers, okay? That is, that is really a key for not having a strong proposal, because this is what reviewers usually are looking for in research proposals. And so you really want to make sure you articulate it early, and you articulate it specifically in a way that will excite your reviewers. Okay. As you're thinking about your research, again, be careful about scope. Okay, so particularly for early career people, one of the most common mistakes they make is they're overly ambitious. Remember, if you're early in your career, you don't have the track record, you don't want to overpromise to do things that are super difficult and do a lot of super difficult things, right? If you are too broad in what you're trying to do, my goal is to pioneer this new way to deliver drugs using these nanoparticles, which will have a coating on them that will put proteins on them and pharmaceutical chemicals on top of that, or whatever, right? And so to do that, so they basically, one mistake, particularly if you're going to NSF and a lot of times NIH, is they focused on the application too much, right? So then, in order to make that work, there are all these challenges, right? A lot of challenges, and they propose to address all the challenges in one project. So in order to do that, then they end up with a very broad proposal that is shallow. You don't have enough room to describe all the challenges, and you don't have you really, even in the project itself, you don't have enough time to do all the things you say you're going to do. So instead of doing that, try going focused and deep. The ultimate long green arrow goal is to enable this entirely new way to deliver pharmaceuticals. One key challenge is we don't know how to attach these chemicals to this particular coating, and we don't understand what's going on there. I'm going to go deep on that. right? Once we can do that, if I solve that, that's a huge advance, right? It's not going to take me all the way there. There's more to do, but I'm going to focus on that. Now this is much more doable. You're not trying to solve 5 different problems. You're solving one really important problem and you're going really deep into it. Okay. So broad and shallow, usually what it ends up doing is you have a number of different difficult gaps that you're trying to address all in one project. That means it's very risky because here you are, and this is particularly if you're early in your career, you're proposing to do 3 things that nobody's been able to do before. That's going to, the reviewers are going to be skeptical about that. If you are then have to kind of be more superficial, I'm just going to try a bunch of different things and see which drugs can attach well to my nanoparticle, and then I'll go on. Well, that's very superficial. You don't know why. Maybe it's just the particular situation and how much it only applies in this particular context. So you don't understand underlying mechanisms of why this pharmaceutical chemical applied. You can't apply that to other pharmaceutical chemicals. So now the application, the knowledge and the significance of what you've learned is not as helpful, right? So again, it kind of forces you to be superficial. One sign that you find that your scope may be too broad is if you have to discuss a bunch of different literatures, right? Well, we have the literature on how to coat these nanoparticles with this coating. And then we have the literature on how to coat the pharmaceutical on there. Then we have the literature on how, when it tries to go across the cell membrane, what happens, okay? That's a sign you're probably trying to do too much and you're too broad. Okay, but remember, this is a line of research. You can get funding for separate projects along the way, rather than trying to promise to do everything in one project. Okay, and then just generally, when you're thinking about new knowledge, you want to think about, okay, why can't I do this now? What are the scientific barriers? What do I need to find out? What are my specific research questions or hypotheses? Or if it's more applied, what am I going to learn about these barriers and challenges that would inform my next approach of this if I'm not successful? So let's say you have an idea for a much more efficient photovoltaic cell, and you want to, you're really working on that particular device with a photovoltaic cell. It doesn't work. Will you learn why, and will that then inform your next attempt? Okay. Just remember, and I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, so I think everybody knows this. The hypothesis is a testable statement that explains a phenomenon or event. Okay, it should allow you to make predictions. That alarm went off, but we only have half an hour left, so we're going to keep going here so we can finish on time. And remember that it needs to usually the predictions need to be tied to some sort of understanding of underlying mechanisms of theory. Okay, so we're not talking about a premise. A premise is we state this is true. Now, based on that, we have these hypotheses. This is what you're going to test in your project. Okay, and it can also inform the strategies and approaches you're going to pursue. So generally, a hypothesis should be significant. It should be non-obvious, and you need to have some evidence to support it, which is usually your preliminary data. Sometimes it's also maybe evidence in the literature. Okay, this is your new knowledge. Okay, there could be sub-hypotheses that are related to a broad central hypothesis. The way you structure this can really vary depending on your project. You can have working hypotheses that, basically you're not saying it's this or that. You're just saying, this is why I'm doing this set of tests or experiments to check out this working hypothesis. And, it might be A, it might be B. My working hypothesis is it's A, I'm going to do these tests. And my working hypothesis is B, I'm going to do these tests and we'll see which one it is. Okay, so those are other ways to structure things. Okay, these are just an example. Now you can also have research questions, and that's true, particularly, at some of the other agencies besides NIH. You can have, like, for this one is, this is about graphene-based nanomaterials in the environment. So she had 3 broad questions. Are the concentrations of graphene-based nanomaterials that are toxic in the lab the same as that are toxic in the environment? That's important. Are the toxic effects of these nanomaterials affected by different water chemistries? Okay, and how do the nanomaterials affect microbial population and that remove nitrogen and so forth from the water? Okay, so you can see this all is relevant to her larger goal to understand the effects of graphene-based nanoparticles in the water, okay, and their effect on microbial populations. And then she's just divided them into 3 questions that are then going to guide her experimental plan. Okay, so but they are very clearly questions, okay, and that have a clear outcome, not just we want to explore how, what happens when we put graphene in the water, right? Very focused, clear questions. Okay, here's another example of somebody who did a broad question. How do parent responses to baby's vocalizations affect the baby's visual attention in the moment as a potential pathway to longer term language development? Okay, so here, and this is a very common use. A lot of times people will say, I have a broad, how does this work? How, what is happening here, right? So those really broad questions, it's fine to have a broad question, but then you need to have either more focused questions or clear hypotheses you're going to test. If you just say, this is my question I'm going to answer, reviewers really don't like that because it's too vague. Okay, so you'll get that back. So be more specific. So that's my broad question. Now, what I'm going to test, I have some hypotheses about how this actually works. My hypotheses I'm going to test are parent responses affect infant attention, and this influences language learning. Parents are more responsive to behaviors that are more speech-like. Okay, and different types of parent responses affect behavior differently, right? So again, this then starts to transition the reader to, okay, these are the experiments she's going to do. And this is what she's trying. These are the things she's going to test. So again, this is all about new knowledge, but how you frame it will depend on your project. But you do want to be, again, walk your reviewer through this logic early in your proposal, and that will set everything up. So when you get into all the nitty gritty of all the experiments and all the different variables and all that sort of stuff, they have this larger view of the elephant and they understand why they're reading all this. Some of this, it can be really obvious to you and not so obvious to the reader if you don't kind of spell it out in this way. And so sometimes you find this out by having other people read your drafts and then come back and they go, I didn't really understand what you were trying to do until I got to page 5. Then you say, oh, okay, I need to back up and I need to kind of spell this out in more detail, exactly what I'm trying to find out. In general, if you're at NSF or NIH, remember, even if you're focused on a particular application, you want to drill down to more fundamental questions that then kind of will be relevant to more than one application. If you are really focused on just one application, usually that's not going to review well. Okay, so you don't want to start, my research question is, I want to develop, how can I develop a new sensor, a new whatever that does XYZ? Doesn't work in NSF or NIH, even if it's a neat thing, like a new way to deliver drugs. You want to say that we're going to learn these things, and then that will pave the way to this new drug, this new better battery, this better, this better software. But you want to focus in on what are the challenges you're going to overcome? What are you going to learn? Another research question you don't want is, well, I have an idea for a new design. Will it work? Yes or no? That's not considered a good research question. Or if I have 10 different designs, will one of them work, right? Again, sort of that all has a whiff of basically trial and error. You want to avoid that. Okay, so what you want to think about when you're describing new knowledge, do your research questions or hypotheses address if it will work, or are they addressing how and why? Okay, in general, you want to think about, am I just collecting information or answering a question? For most agencies, and definitely NSF and NIH, they want you to be answering questions, not just collecting information. And so and usually you are trying to do that, you just may not articulate it well. And so you really need to kind of step back and think, how do I articulate this? Okay. And then this is just more examples, about, mechanistic hypothesis that requires, okay. If you are in the social science, physical science, life science, humanity, generally they like to see some sort of underlying theory, okay. It expands your significance because you're saying, I not only will answer this question, but this will either inform theory, challenge theory, build on theory, whatever. So think about that. Again, this varies by your field, okay. Now, for those of you doing any kind of more programmatic grant, as I said, the framework is usually a little different. You're not really doing fun research where you are answering questions, but you do have to have a rationale with evidence for what your strategy is going to be to address a particular need. Okay. And then, you know, again, you have to really be clear about the logistics of what you're doing and what the impact is going to be. And usually they want to see impact and outcomes. So this is where this is where you need to have some sort of evaluation plan. If you're going to improve retention in a calculus class, if you're going to provide scholarships for a certain number of students, you know, you have to talk about, well, what was the impact? Did they come through? What is your plan for determining that? If they had research experiences in the summer, what's your plan for determining if they learned anything, right? All that kind of stuff is going to be in that, be expected here. For the rationale, usually having, again, this, you're going to either have preliminary data or data in the literature for why a particular approach works. So for example, you know, we want to provide this therapy to these teenagers with borderline personality disorder. And our approach is we're going to involve families in this to a much greater degree than people have in the past. And we have evidence for that in the literature, why we think that'll work. Okay. And so I would say, again, for a homework exercise, if you're doing this, you know, kind of explain to people what your main research questions and hypotheses are, or if it's more applied, your central challenges. If it's programmatic or an intervention, what are your central ideas for your strategy? And then write them down. Okay. Your approach, okay, is basically where, you know, basically the rubber meets the road. Okay, this is where you actually have to describe what your objectives or aims are going to be. And they need to tie to your project goal, right? And they need to tie to your questions or hypotheses or challenges. So this is not like a task list of 10 things, right? 10, and the number of objectives or aims will depend on the amount of money you have, the amount of time you have, and what, you know, the project you're trying to do. But typically no more than 5. For in NIH, you know, you usually for an R01, if you're a new investigator, no more than 3 aims is usually what they recommend. If it's a small project, if it's an R03, it might just be 1 aim. Okay. Okay, so these are examples. This one is more process focused. Collect longitudinal data, devise fast and reliable feature extraction algorithms, develop those algorithms for matching, and then fuse this particular method with iris recognition and so forth for cybersecurity. Okay, so you can see they are stepping through a process. That wouldn't work for NIH, but for NSF, a lot of times people will do that. Okay. Big thing though is if you are doing steps, step by step, first we're going to do this, then we're going to do this. Don't put a high risk step or objective at the beginning. Okay. You absolutely, those are called house of cards proposals. Reviewers hate those because you could fail at the very beginning. In fact, if it's high risk, it's likely you will fail at the beginning. So you want to be really careful about this. If you have a step that's high risk, then either you want to pull it out as its own project, okay, and make sure you can do that, or you want to have preliminary data showing, no, it's not as high risk as you might think. Okay, but don't propose something. So for example, I have an idea for developing an invisibility cloak. My first thing is to develop particles that are invisible. Then I'm going to weave it into a cloth. Then I'm going to do all these tests, right? Well, they're going to say, no, 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 no. Now they might fund me for just a more contained project just to develop those invisible particles. Okay, then I can come back and ask for the next steps, or I can generate preliminary data showing, yeah, I almost have invisible particles. They're pretty close to invisible. Okay. And so this is not that high risk, but don't pile a whole lot of objectives on top of a risky objective, because usually reviewers will not be comfortable with that. All right. Specific aims, I think some of this I'm going to let you all, because I know many of you are not NIH folks, and I've already talked about this a little bit. Remember, for NIH, they need to be independent, make them knowledge focused, and that will help you to do that. And generally, they want them to be hypothesis driven. There's some examples here you can look at. More examples where they've tied clearly to hypotheses, and I've already mentioned this. Okay, more resources for you. Okay, so as you're ready to start to figure out what your aims or objectives are, I think it's helpful just to start to think about, okay, your hypotheses or questions that you already, or challenges. Now, how are you going to address those? And then what are the steps going to be? And, you know, a lot of times what you can do is start to kind of figure out, okay, if I'm going to do this, then I'm going to do that, and even come up with a flow chart and start to see how everything kind of lines up. And that can help you to start to see what your main objectives are. And then the last thing is that your outcomes, clearly most important. If you don't have outcomes and impact, there's no significance. Nobody wants to fund you. Okay, so basically you want to make sure if you are doing something more applied, then think about your metrics, right? If you are saying you're going to improve something, you're going to make it stronger, better, cheaper, do you need some sort of metrics to show that you've been successful, or at least mention what your targets are? This is especially important for applied proposals. Okay. In general, you can usually frame your significance impact in a number of different levels. So you do, again, remember your audience, remember what your funders are looking for. So you may have impact that is really has to do with answering a very clear question in your field, and you may have impact in terms of how this is going to impact the broader issues in the society, broader issues in your field, broader issues in other scientific fields. All of that you can talk about. And NSF, they talk about intellectual merit is those fundamental questions, and broader impacts is, you know, kind of the broader, how does this impact this society and improve, you know, kind of the environment and so forth. Okay, so you can think about this again, put yourself in the place of the reviewer and the program officer, and make sure you make the arguments that make sense, rather than again thinking, oh, well, we will learn about this one very particular, question that if it's that many people in the review panel never occurred to them to worry about it. Step back a little bit and say, well, when we do that, this will allow, pave the way to better batteries, or to being able to make a better insulator or whatever, right? So thinking about it in terms of what's going to excite them. Okay, and then here's some examples for you to look at later. Okay, remember too, when you're talking, it's very much starting out in this first section, that you want to really grab that reviewer very early on. So think about that reviewer, for example, if they're a reviewer for a biofuels program, and you start with these really very general questions, or very general statements. The US is facing a critical problem with energy supply, or biofuels are an environmentally friendly, approach to dealing with energy, or to meet the nation's energy needs, we have to do X, Y, Z. These are all, if this is a biofuels program, any of these sentences could fit in any proposal in that stack. Okay, you don't want to do that. Thinking about the very first sentence of your specific aims page and your project description, make it specific to your project. Okay, so the fourth proposal says, a critical problem making biofuels practical is X. This step X, we have a new idea for a new synthesis process to do that. So really foreground your ideas, put them right up front. Again, you may need to talk about the problem, but again, make it specific to your project, not something that would fit in any proposal in that stack. Okay, now it depends on what the program is, what else is going to be there, right? So if this were a chemistry program, maybe yours is the only biofuels program proposal, and you do want to start with that. So how do you know what else is in the stack? You do your research we talked about earlier. You look at what else has been funded by that particular program, and you can then think, do I need to go into tons of, kind of all this background on why cancer is bad, why biofuels is good, that kind of stuff? Or is that something that the reviewers will already know? And is that something that, is going to be discussed in every other proposal also? So start fast rather than this generic introduction and then a long discussion of everything that is being done in biofuels, and then finally describing what you're going to do. Put it up front. Move your most exciting stuff right up front, and then talk about everything in the context of your exciting stuff. Okay, so that means you need to put the kernel of your great idea at the front, right? At that first page. What you're going to accomplish is a lot of times what your great idea is. So that's your goal. A lot of people start with a goal. It may be though that everybody's goal is the same, but based on the solicitation, and it's the approach, and you may start with that. Or it may be the problem. Okay, and that's nobody else is looking at this problem. Or it may be that you have a new tool, okay, a new resource, and you have a new access to new materials or data. Whatever it is, put it up front. Okay, that is really the way to grab your reviewer in the first page or so of your proposal. Okay, and so in general, that means you need to know what the kernel of a great idea is. What is it that's going to make your proposal stand out from the others in the stack, and be able to kind of make sure that you can address that in the first paragraph or so of your proposal. Okay, so that's what a lot of these B versions that we went through did. They put everything right up front, and they talked about what is their great idea right up front. Okay, and then I'm going to skip through stuff about this is all for you to look at later. Oh, I've already, oops. Okay, so all of that was all about the overview section. So talking about how to articulate your goals, your hypotheses, all this sort of stuff. Now you're going to go into a lot more detail. Okay, so your background, motivation, current state of knowledge, whatever it is that's required in your particular, maybe significance for NIH. This is where you describe the gaps. Right. And you may also describe your need or motivation, but you again, make sure you are clear about what the reviewers need to know. Right. So you can, maybe that you have to support your premise, but the big thing, if you're talking about the need or motivation, are you preaching to the choir? A lot of times people will spend a lot of time talking about, again, why cancer is bad, why STEM diversity in STEM education is good, all this stuff that basically, the reviewers and the program officer are already on board because they're funding this grant for that reason. Don't use a lot of space on that. Then you can put a few, a little bit of data to convey to talk about specifics, but this, you have to really think, do they need to know this, or do they already know this, right? When you're talking about motivation, a lot of times people will go on and on. I was just reading a proposal where they went on and on about inequality, how bad it is that, there is all this income inequality. Well, I think we all know that, right? The question is, what are you going to do about it? Right? You can put a little bit of data. Yeah, this is, that really says, okay, we got, 90% of the resources are owned by 3% of the people or whatever. But you don't have to go on for 2 pages about income inequality. Anybody that reads the New York Times knows this. Get to what reviewers are going to want to know is, what are you going to do about it? Why do you think it's going to work? And what have other people done? What's different, or what are you trying to answer? What questions you're trying to answer? So again, you have to be careful. Now, it may be that what you're doing, you do need to talk about motivation. Why do I care about this catalyst? Or why do I care about XYZ? Then you may need to talk about it. Generally, though, a lot of what you want to talk about is your state of the art. What have others done? In relevance, not to just the need or the ultimate application, but to the research questions and hypotheses you articulated. Okay, again, remember that this is not just about in practice, what are the gaps, but in research, what are the gaps? What if people who, like you, who are publishing the same journals you're publishing in, what have they done? What have they not done? What are you building on? What's different about what you're doing? Okay, this one is always important to remember. This is, what does the literature bring to this project? Not, let me do a literature review of this whole topic. So you're always kind of need to relate. So and so did this, but they weren't able to do this. Our project will do that. So and so did that. We are going to build on that and use that same method because it worked, and we're going to apply it here, right? So make those connections for the reviewer. Don't expect them to figure it out on their own. Okay, common mistakes people make here is they teach kind of, for example, that biofuels example, biofuels 101, everything about how we make biofuels, and eventually they get down to this particular step that's a problem. You don't need to do that if you know that this is a biofuels panel, right? You can go right to what you're trying to do and focus on that step. And what have other people tried to do about that particular step that's a problem? And what are you doing that's different? Okay, going too long. A lot of times people find this is very easy to write, and they write it more like a literature review, and then they find they have only 2 pages to talk about what they'll do if they get funded. You want to avoid that. Remember, what you will do when you get funded should be the biggest section. This should be context, but you have to kind of contain it. reciting everything that's been done without connecting it to the proposed project. Again, a lot of times that may not be obvious to a reviewer. Okay. And or the other option is sometimes people will say, well, my idea is so great. Nobody has done anything of any value in this area before. And so who has done nothing of any value? Probably your reviewers. You probably just insulted all your reviewers. So anything you do, no matter how innovative, you're building on something. So you definitely want to talk about that. Okay. The next section, preliminary data, that can be put in its own section. It can be put within your approach section, your experimental plan section. But the big thing is make it easy to find. Okay. Don't let it get lost because this is hugely important. So don't fold it into your background. So-and-so did this, then I did this, and so-and-so did this, because the reviewer at 2 in.the morning might miss that. And this is the only evidence you have, that in your publications, that you can actually do what you're proposing to do. So somebody should be able to flip through your proposal and find your preliminary work. Right up, easy. It could be a subsection, it's bolded, underlined, whatever. Make it stand out. Exactly where you put it will depend on the funder, depend on your project, and depend on how, where it really fits. Okay. Again, give the outline of the elephant on your preliminary work, particularly if you have a lot of preliminary results. Explain the results and the relevance in a few sentences, give that overview, and then go into the detail. Okay. Be careful about, again, letting this section get too large to where you have no room to talk about what you will do if you get funded. You have to, it's not the paper journal article. You have to kind of, again, make it really clear. This is how it's relevant, but be careful about that. Never use passive voice when you're talking about preliminary results, because you need to make it clear, I did this. At 2 in.the morning, if you say these specimens were tested, this was done, that was done, it can get confusing to the reviewer, whether you're talking about somebody else that you talked about a minute, in the previous page, or you're talking about yourself. Who is we? If you say we, make it clear who is we. You and your student, you and a collaborator, you and your advisor. You want to say who those people are. Okay. And then just make it clear, what is the relevance to your current project? Is it that you got these great, intriguing results and now this is a motivation for your project? Is it that this shows feasibility of your idea? Is it that it shows you have a command of the methodology? Whatever your point is for the results you're talking about, just don't be coy, just tell them, right? Again, make it easy for your reviewer. Okay, this is an example where they had a lot of preliminary results, a lot of images from a new kind of microscope, and she just put this right up front. This shows feasibility in summary, and she shows, okay, figure 3 shows this, figure 4 shows that, figure 5 shows this. Okay, and so she just spelled it out, and then she went in and showed all those figures and had a lot more detail. By putting that right up front, she oriented the reader first. They understood what what the big picture was, that outline of the elephant, before she went into tons of detail. Okay, all right. So we've talked about what you're going to do, why you should do it. Now, you got to talk about how you're going to do it. That is the hardest part, really, a lot of times. And that is your experimental plan, project plan, approach section, whatever it's called. Okay. So this is really key to, are you going to be likely to be successful? They're going to look at your preliminary data. They're going to look at your track record, but have you really thought through your methodology and work plan? That is really going to make or break your proposal. A lot of people do a great job up to this point, and then they get very vague. Okay, so remember too, you need not only to talk about your methodology, your rationale, your approach, but also your work plan. First, we're going to do this, then we're going to do this, then we're going to do that, and so forth. So don't forget about that. A lot of people will talk all day about their algorithms, about a particular method, a particular design, but they actually don't say actually what they will do. Okay, so you do need that also. Clear objectives, clear tasks, make a clear structure, talk positively, not we could, we might, we could, we will do this, then we will do that. If this happens, we will do this. Okay, so again, have courage of your convictions, be definite. Even if it doesn't work out, you just need a plan. Okay, and then again, give an overview at the beginning of this section, and then go through step by step what's going to happen. Okay, you're gonna, if there are showstoppers, talk about those in more detail. So anytime there's a risky step, Don't skip over it. And that actually reviewers will think you don't know it's risky. And then that makes you look naive, which is the kiss of death, right? You want to say, yeah, I know this is potentially risky. This is why I think I can do it. This is my workaround if it doesn't work or whatever. Okay. And there should be some risk in any research project. If it's a done deal, that would have already been done. So, some risk is okay. All right. And then just make sure you don't lose your reviewers. Okay. Allocate more space for challenging tasks, novel or risky tasks, and tasks that require more resources. Okay. If you need special resources, make sure you talk about how you're going to get them. If you have collaborators, talk about them as you talk about the tasks that they will do. Don't wait till the end of the proposal to the narrative to describe that, oh yeah, by the way, I have 3 people who are going to help me with this. Mention it as you go through. Okay. Common mistake is the miracle occurs here plan. Going skating over just kind of risky steps. Having a long kind of unorganized plan that's kind of a rambling discussion of what you might do. Not aligning your project goals with the objectives. So you're basically what you're going to actually accomplish is not what you stated as your goal. Having too much detail, too little detail. Remember, this is not a journal article. Nobody wants to reproduce your work. The reviewers just want to see, can you do it? Is this feasible? Is this likely to succeed? Okay. So think really about, if I got the money, what would I do first? What would I do second? If I were meeting with my grad student, what would I tell them we need to get done by the end of the first 6 months, and so forth? That will help you. And then I think, again, an exercise where you actually do a flow chart can really be helpful here. Now, there are a number of other sections, and as I said, I was going to skip over a lot of this. These are more kind of as resources for you. A lot of times a schedule, know your funder and kind of what level of detail they want for schedules. The more applied your research, the more likely they're going to want a really detailed schedule. Okay. And different funders are different that way too. Okay, once you finish a draft, get other people to read it, include times for revisions. And then this is just, all these other sections, which again are just your resources. As I said earlier, you can download all these slides. I'm not going to read those to you. And then once you submit your proposal, you're going to have to wait a while. Okay, so what's happening? They're reviewing your proposal, can be a panel, can be ad hoc, where these are people who are chosen just for your proposal. And then here's more information on the review process for NIH, how they score things. Sometimes it's, different funders will do things differently. So NIH gives you scores. USDA will also gives a score and a ranking. NSF just gives excellent, very good, good, fair, poor, and then puts you in 3 buckets, whether you're actually highly recommended, or not recommended. They use different wording depending on the division. So different funders will do things differently. Make sure you understand how those work. And this is all just for those of you in NIH. Okay. If you do get funded, obviously be happy. Just remember, this is the start of your journey. You want to do a good job, because every time you go back for funding, they're going to ask you, how did that go? We gave you funding before. How did it go? So make sure you understand what the program officer sees as a good job. If you don't get funded, okay, read the reviews, get mad and depressed. Everybody does. It's really frustrating, but remember, this is part of the process. Everybody who's been well-funded has had proposals declined. Put it away for a while, come back, okay? And then look, did all the reviewers pick on one particular thing? A lot of times that really actually is a good thing, because you can fix that. Were they confused or unclear about your project? Get some other folks to read your proposal and see if maybe you lost them, or you assume they had background they didn't have. Were they unimpressed by the significance or novelty of your research? That's a lot of times the kiss of death. So now you have to decide, are they right? Is this project just not, novel enough, not sexy enough for this particular agency? Or did I not explain it well enough? Okay. Were the reviewers generally favorable with no clear issues brought up? This is the most frustrating. And this is where talking to the program officer can usually help you. Okay. Did it not fit the program? If there's a panel, and there's usually a panel summary, and that's where you want to start your reading, because a lot of times that's what was actually discussed, and that can tell you what the most important issues were. Okay, talk to the program officer. Generally, they're not all program officers are open to this, but NSF and NIH definitely are. Be nice, and you remember you want advice from them. So ask them about, okay, this is what they said. What do you think? And a lot of times they can give you more insight in what the dynamics of the panel were. And then you can decide, I want to resubmit this. I'm going to revise it. I'm going to take one aim out. I'm going to, I'm going to change this thing. I'm going to get more preliminary data. I'm going to this wasn't a good fit for this panel. I'm going to send it to a different panel or program. It doesn't, I thought this was fancy enough for NSF. It's not going to work at NSF. I'm going to go to Department of Energy. I think it'll work better there, right? Or, I've tried this idea 3 times. Nobody wants to fund it. I'm going to put it away in the drawer. I'm going to go for a different idea. And that happens all the time. People will decide, just not the right time for this. I've tried, time to move on. And that's not a defeat. You can still get funded on other projects. So just remember, you want to keep working as you wait. If you're going to revise and resubmit, a lot of times you may, it may be a year later or maybe 6 months later. Keep working, getting more preliminary data, getting publications out. You can volunteer to review at a lot of these agencies, so that can really help you understand your program. So all of those are things that you're going to help you learn how to write your proposal, get to know your funder and your program better. And it is just a learned skill. That is really how nobody's born learning how to write a proposal. It is something you learn by doing, getting those reviews back, and then, learning from what they're telling you. Okay, and there are a lot of helpful resources out there for NSF, for NIH. All of those are, it can really be helpful to kind of as you figure out where you really want to go for funding. I know we're out of time, so I just wanted to open it up though for questions. I'm happy to stick around as long as you guys need. Does anybody have any questions? All right. Okay, I'll send it over to you then, Jane, and you can wrap it up for us.
Sure. Lucy, I just want to thank you on behalf of all the people that have benefited from your sage advice this afternoon. Reminder to everybody that the slides and the supporting materials used in this workshop will be available at the link that Lucy provided, and we will post that also on our website so that you can access those and come back and see us at the Office of Research Development if you need help with putting any of these things into action in your own proposals. And we hope to see you later. So thanks, Lucy.
Okay, thanks everybody.
Awesome.
Good luck with your proposals.